Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for something truly cozy by talking about a time when being cozy was basically impossible. We're diving into what it was actually like to survive a medieval winter, and I mean survive in the most literal sense possible. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim those lights, grab your blanket, maybe some tea. Appreciate your central heating for a moment because trust me, by the end of this, you're going to want to kiss your thermostat. Tonight, we're exploring the cold, dark, frankly miserable reality of winter in medieval Europe. We're talking about the period roughly between 500 and 1500 CE, when winter wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a genuine threat to your existence. No fleece-lined everything, no grocery stores stocked year-round with fresh produce, no popping down to the pharmacy for cold medicine. Just you, the freezing darkness, and the very real possibility that you might not make it to spring. And look, we romanticize medieval times a lot. Knights in shining armor, grand castles, maidens in flowing gowns. But here's the thing, those castles were absolutely freezing. Those flowing gowns were woefully inadequate, and those knights? Yeah, they were cold too. Let's start with the big picture. Medieval winters were, on average, colder than what we experience today in most of Europe. Depending on where you were in the medieval period, you might have been living through what historians call the medieval warm period, which lasted roughly from 950 to 1250 CE. Sounds nice, right? Wrong. It was only warm comparatively. Winters still froze solid, rivers still iced over, people still died from the cold regularly. And then, if you were unlucky enough to be alive from around 1300 onwards, you got to experience the beginning of the Little Ice Age. This was a period of cooling that lasted into the 19th century, and it made winters significantly worse. We're talking rivers freezing that normally didn't freeze, crops failing, famines, whole villages just not making it.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the basics. What was it actually like to experience winter if you were just a regular person living in medieval Europe? First off, darkness. So much darkness. If you lived in Northern Europe, say England, Scotland, Scandinavia, Northern France, Germany, winter meant the sun barely showed up. We're talking maybe 8 hours of daylight in December, and that's if you were lucky enough to have clear skies, which you often weren't. It was just gray and dim and depressing for months on end. And you couldn't just flip a switch when it got dark. Lighting was expensive and kind of dangerous. If you were a peasant, which statistically you absolutely were, you went to bed when the sun went down, because burning candles or oil lamps all evening was a luxury you couldn't afford. Candles were made from tallow, which is animal fat, and that was valuable. You could eat that fat, so burning it for light was not something you did casually. The wealthy could afford beeswax candles, which actually smelled decent, unlike tallow candles which smelled like burning meat, because that's what they were. But even wealthy people didn't just light up their entire castle every night. They'd have candles in the rooms they were using, sure, but the rest of the place? Dark, cold, probably haunted, honestly. So your medieval winter experience started with just existing in darkness for a huge portion of your life. You'd wake up in the dark. You'd do your morning tasks in the dark or dim light. You'd get maybe a few hours of actual daylight if the weather cooperated, then back to darkness. And it was cold. Obviously it was cold, but the kind of cold we're talking about was inescapable. There was no warm room waiting for you, no heated car to sit in, no heated anything really, except maybe, if you were lucky, a fire. Let's talk about fires. Fires were everything in medieval winter. Your fire was your heat source, your cooking method, your light source, your social gathering spot. The fire was life. But keeping a fire going all winter was not simple. If you were a peasant, you lived in what was basically a one-room house. Sometimes it was stone, sometimes timber and daub, sometimes just mud bricks. The roof was probably thatch. There might be one window, or maybe none, because windows meant cold air getting in, and glass windows were absolutely not a thing you had access to. Glass windows were for rich people, and even then they were small and not particularly effective. Your house probably had a central hearth, just a fire pit in the middle of the room, with smoke rising up and eventually making its way out through a hole in the roof, sometimes. Other times, the smoke just kind of hung around in the room with you, which was unpleasant, but also kind of warm, so you dealt with it. The thing about medieval peasant houses is that they weren't insulated at all. The walls had gaps, the roof leaked, the floor was dirt, or if you were fancy, maybe packed earth with some rushes thrown on top. Cold air came in from everywhere. The wind just whistled through your house like it owned the place. So you'd huddle near the fire, but here's the problem. Fire has a front and a back. The front is warm, the back of you is still freezing. People would literally rotate like rotisserie chickens, warming one side, then turning to warm the other side. You'd be overheated on one side and frozen on the other simultaneously. Comfortable? No. But it beat freezing to death, so there you go. Keeping the fire supplied with fuel was a constant job. You needed wood, and lots of it. If you lived near a forest, great. You'd spend a good portion of autumn gathering and chopping wood for winter. You'd need to stockpile enough to last months, and you couldn't just cut down any tree you wanted. Forests were often owned by the local lord, and there were laws about what you could and couldn't take. Get caught stealing wood, you could be fined, or worse. If you didn't live near a forest, you might burn peat, which is decomposed plant material dug out of bogs. It burns slow and smoky and doesn't smell great, but it works. Or you might burn dried animal dung. Yes, really. Cow pies, once dried, burn reasonably well. Was it pleasant? No. Did it keep you from freezing? Yes. Medieval life was all about these kinds of trade-offs. And you had to keep that fire going constantly, because starting a new fire was annoying. You didn't have matches, you had a flint and steel, and if you were good at it, you could strike sparks onto some char cloth or dry tinder and get it going. But it was a whole process, so instead, you just didn't let the fire go out. You'd bank it at night, covering the coals with ash to slow the burn, and then revive it in the morning. If your fire went out completely, you'd probably just go to a neighbor and beg some coals to restart yours. Let's talk about what you wore, because clothing in medieval winter was crucial and also deeply inadequate by our standards. If you were a peasant, you had like one outfit, maybe two if you were doing well. This would be a long tunic, basically a big shirt that came down to your knees or longer. It was made of wool, probably, if you were lucky. Wool is actually great for cold weather. It insulates even when wet. But the wool you had access to was probably coarse and itchy and not particularly well made. Under that, you might have a linen undershirt. Linen isn't warm, but it's what was available, and it created a layer between your skin and the scratchy wool. On your legs, maybe some wool hose, basically long socks that went up to your thighs. These were tied to your belt because elastic wasn't a thing yet. On your feet, leather shoes if you had them, leather boots if you were wealthy, or just wrapped cloth if you were poor. And here's the thing about medieval shoes. They weren't waterproof. Leather shoes get wet, and then your feet are wet and cold all day. People suffered from chronic foot problems, frostbite, infections, all kinds of nastiness.
Over all this, you'd have a cloak, just a big piece of wool fabric you wrapped around yourself. This was your coat, basically. The wealthy had cloaks lined with fur, which was actually warm and lovely. You had a plain wool cloak that got wet when it rained or snowed, and then didn't really dry until summer. You did not have different outfits for different occasions. You had your clothes. You wore them every day. You slept in them, because taking them off meant being even colder at night. You maybe washed them a few times a year, if that. They smelled bad. You smelled bad. Everyone smelled bad. But at least you were all in it together. The wealthy had more clothes, obviously, multiple layers, better quality wool, linen that was actually soft, fur linings, silk if they were really wealthy. Though silk isn't particularly warm, it was just expensive and showed you had money. They had gloves and better cloaks and clothes that actually fit properly. But even wealthy people were cold. Their castles and manor houses were massive stone structures that were basically impossible to heat. A castle in winter was a cold, drafty nightmare. You'd heat the great hall with a big fireplace, sure. Maybe your bedchamber had a fireplace too, but the corridors, the stairwells, the outer rooms, freezing. Absolutely freezing. People would hang tapestries on the walls, not just for decoration, but because they added a tiny bit of insulation and blocked some of the drafts. They'd put down rushes or straw on the floors for the same reason, but it barely helped. Stone walls and floors just radiate cold. There was no escaping it. At night, everyone, rich and poor, piled into bed under every blanket and fur they owned. The wealthy had feather beds and down coverlets and bed curtains that created a little enclosed space to trap warmth. The poor had straw mattresses and wool blankets, and maybe a fur if they were lucky. And often you'd share your bed with your whole family because body heat was valuable. Privacy was not a medieval concept, especially not in winter.
Rich people also employed bed warmers. A servant would fill a metal pan with hot coals from the fire, put it on a long handle, and slide it between the sheets before you got into bed. This would take the edge off the cold, at least initially. Of course, this also occasionally set beds on fire, because medieval life was just one safety hazard after another. But mostly it worked out fine. Children and elderly people suffered the most from the cold. They couldn't regulate their body temperature as well, and they often didn't have priority access to the warmest spots near the fire. Infant mortality was high anyway in medieval times, but winter made it worse. Babies died from cold, from illness, from lack of adequate nutrition. It was just a fact of life. A grim fact, but there it is. Elderly people often didn't survive winter. If you made it to old age in medieval times, which was itself uncommon, winter was your enemy. Your body couldn't handle the cold and the damp and the diseases that came with the season. Families knew that every winter might be Grandma's last. Sometimes people would even say goodbye in autumn, with the understanding they might not see each other again come spring. Let's talk about food, because winter meant your diet became extremely limited and extremely boring. Medieval people didn't have refrigeration, obviously. They had to preserve everything in autumn to last through winter. And preservation methods were okay, sometimes, if you did everything right, which people didn't always do. Salting was the big one. You'd slaughter animals in late autumn, around November, because you couldn't keep them fed through winter anyway. You'd salt the meat heavily, pack it in barrels, and hope it lasted.
Salted meat tastes like salt, just overwhelming salt, and it's tough and kind of gross, but it keeps you alive, so you eat it.
Smoking meat was another option. Smoke it and dry it. Hang it up and it'll keep for months. Smoked meat is a bit better than salted meat, but after eating it for 4 months straight, you'd be pretty sick of it. Fish was preserved the same way. Salted fish, dried fish, smoked fish. If you lived near the coast or a river, fish might be a big part of your winter diet. Salted cod, salted herring, dried stockfish that was so hard you had to beat it with a hammer before you could cook it. Delicious? No. Nutritious enough to keep you going? Yes. Vegetables were limited. Root vegetables kept reasonably well if you stored them right. Turnips, onions, carrots, parsnips. You'd store them in a root cellar if you had one, buried in sand or straw to keep them from freezing or rotting. But they'd slowly deteriorate over the winter, getting softer and sprouting and generally becoming less appetizing. Cabbage could be preserved as sauerkraut. Apples kept for a while if stored carefully. Dried beans and peas were a staple. They lasted indefinitely and provided protein. You'd make a lot of pottage, which was basically a thick soup or stew made from whatever you had. Beans, some old vegetables, maybe a bit of salted meat if you were lucky, all boiled together into a grayish mush. You ate this almost every day. It was fine. Not good. Just fine. Bread was a staple if you could get grain. Grain stores from the harvest had to last until the next harvest, which was many months away. You'd grind flour as you needed it, because flour goes bad faster than whole grain. The bread was dense and dark and would get stale quickly. Stale bread was soaked in pottage or ale to soften it up. Waste nothing. The wealthy ate better, obviously. They had access to more variety, more spices to make things taste less terrible, more preserved fruits and nuts. They had honey to sweeten things. They had access to the best cuts of meat. But even they were eating a lot of salted and preserved foods because there just weren't fresh options in the middle of winter. Fresh meat in winter was rare and special. If someone slaughtered an animal mid-winter, it was an event. The meat had to be eaten quickly before it spoiled, so it would be shared or turned into a feast. This is part of why medieval people feasted so much in winter. When there was fresh food, you ate as much as you could while it was still good. And speaking of feasts, let's talk about Christmas and winter celebrations, because honestly, they were one of the few things that made winter bearable. Christmas in medieval times was a huge deal. It wasn't just one day, it was a whole season, the 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to January 6th. This was a time when work stopped, more or less, and people focused on celebration and religion and trying to forget how miserable everything was. The wealthy would host massive feasts. We're talking whole roasted animals, pies filled with birds, spiced wine, entertainment, music. It was excessive and wonderful, and a welcome break from the cold and dark. Lords were expected to be generous during Christmas, feeding not just their own household, but also the local poor. It was a social obligation. Show off your wealth and share it around a little bit. For peasants, Christmas meant a break from work and hopefully some better food than usual. Maybe your lord gave you some extra rations. Maybe the church provided a meal. Maybe you'd slaughter one of your own animals and have a small family feast. Either way, it was something to look forward to. The religious aspect was important too. Church services, nativity plays, singing. Medieval people were deeply religious, and Christmas was one of the most important holy days. Going to church meant gathering with your community, being in a space that was slightly warmer than your house because of all the bodies packed in, singing together. It was comforting in a season that was otherwise pretty bleak. New Year and Epiphany were also celebrated. More feasting, more drinking, more trying to convince yourself that winter wouldn't last forever. But then the 12 days ended, and you were back to reality. January and February stretched ahead, cold and dark and seemingly endless. These were the hardest months. Your food stores were getting low. Your firewood pile was shrinking. Everyone was sick of being inside and cold and eating the same things over and over. This was when people died most. Food ran out. Illness spread in close quarters. The very young and the very old succumbed to the cold. Villages would lose people every winter. You'd go into winter with your community and come out of it smaller. Let me paint you a picture of a typical day in deep winter for a medieval peasant. You wake up in the dark. You're cold because the fire burned low overnight. You're sharing a bed with your spouse and probably your children, all huddled under a wool blanket and whatever other coverings you own. Your breath is visible in the air. You get up, still wearing the same clothes you wore yesterday and the day before and will wear tomorrow. You revive the fire, adding wood carefully because you need to make your supply last. The room slowly warms, but only near the fire. The rest of the house stays cold. Breakfast is leftover pottage from last night, maybe some stale bread. You eat near the fire. The children complain. You tell them to be grateful. Everyone's in a bad mood because it's cold and dark and you're all sick of being cooped up together.
If you're a man, you bundle up and go outside to tend to the animals. The cold hits you immediately. Everything is frozen or covered in snow. The animals are miserable too. You feed them what little you can spare, check that they're still alive, and hurry back inside. If you're a woman, you're doing indoor work, spinning wool, mending clothes, preparing food, trying to keep the children occupied. They're restless and bored. There's no school. There are no toys, really. They might have a stick or a ball made of rags. Mostly, they just get in the way and complain. Midday brings a bit of light, if you're lucky. You eat again. More pottage. Maybe some cheese if you have it. You're sick of pottage. Everyone is sick of pottage. You eat it anyway. The afternoon is more of the same. Chores, maintenance, trying to stay warm. Maybe you visit a neighbor just for something to do, some different conversation. You gossip. You complain about the cold. You speculate about when spring might come. Everyone is desperate for spring. As the sun sets, which it does distressingly early, you're back to darkness. Supper is, you guessed it, pottage. Maybe you've added some dried fish tonight. Luxury. You eat, you sit by the fire for a bit, and then you go to bed because there's nothing else to do and you need to conserve firewood. You huddle under your blankets. You're still a bit cold. You listen to the wind outside. You hope tomorrow might be better, or at least not worse. You sleep. And then you do it all again the next day, and the next, and the next, for months. This was winter. This was life. And people just endured it, because what else were you going to do?
Welcome back. Hope you're still cozy, because now we're getting into the really grim stuff. Well, grim in a gentle, sleepy way. We're talking about the specific miseries that made medieval winter not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous to your health and sanity. Let's start with illness, because winter and sickness went together like, well, like two things that go together really badly, but you can't separate them. Medieval people got sick constantly in winter, and I mean constantly. Respiratory infections, influenza, pneumonia, bronchitis, anything that could attack your lungs was having a field day. And why wouldn't it? You were living in close quarters with your entire family, breathing in smoke from the fire all day, probably malnourished, definitely cold and damp. Your immune system was struggling. The thing about medieval houses is that they were either freezing or full of smoke, usually both. That smoke we mentioned earlier. Sure, it added some warmth, but it also destroyed your lungs over time. Chronic respiratory problems were just part of life. Everyone had a cough. Everyone. The question wasn't whether you'd get a cough in winter, but whether it would turn into something that ended you. Pneumonia was a major problem. Get a bad cold, it settles in your chest, you can't get warm and dry, and boom, pneumonia. And there was no treatment, nothing that worked anyway. You either recovered on your own or you didn't. Plenty of people didn't. Influenza swept through communities regularly. The flu could wipe out a significant portion of a village in a bad year. You'd get a fever, body aches, terrible cough, and you'd just have to ride it out in your freezing house, hoping you survived. Children and elderly people often didn't. Even healthy adults could succumb if the strain was bad enough.
Then there were the digestive issues. Food poisoning was common because preserved food was always a gamble. That salted meat might be fine, or it might have gone bad in a way you couldn't detect until you'd already eaten it. Spoiled food in winter could mean days of misery, vomiting and other unpleasantness, losing precious fluids and nutrients you couldn't afford to lose. Dysentery showed up even in winter, though it was worse in summer. Contaminated water, poor sanitation, close living quarters, it spread. And dysentery in medieval times was often a death sentence, especially for the very young or old. You'd waste away, unable to keep anything in your system, getting weaker and weaker. Frostbite was obviously a concern. Fingers, toes, ears, noses, extremities were vulnerable. If you had to work outside in winter, and most people did, you were at risk. Mild frostbite was painful but recoverable. Severe frostbite meant losing digits or even entire limbs. And the treatment for severe frostbite was, well, there wasn't one really. The affected parts would blacken and die, and if you were lucky, a barber surgeon might amputate before infection spread. If you were unlucky, the infection would spread anyway, and that was that. Chilblains were a chronic problem. These are painful inflammations of small blood vessels in your skin caused by repeated exposure to cold. Your fingers and toes would swell up, turn red or purple, itch like crazy, and hurt. Almost everyone who lived in a cold climate had chilblains. They'd develop in early winter and just persist until spring. Miserable but not life-threatening, so you just dealt with it. Hypothermia was a constant threat, especially for the poor and homeless. Yes, medieval cities had homeless people, and winter was brutal for them. Without access to shelter or adequate clothing, you could freeze to death on the streets. It happened regularly. Cities would find bodies in the morning, people who'd succumbed to the cold overnight.
Sometimes charitable institutions or monasteries would provide shelter, but there wasn't nearly enough space for everyone who needed it. Even for people with homes, hypothermia was possible. If your fire went out and you couldn't restart it, if you ran out of firewood, if your house was particularly drafty, you could freeze in your own home. Elderly people living alone were especially vulnerable. They'd be found days later, frozen solid.
Now, let's talk about medieval medicine, because their understanding of illness was creative. Wildly inaccurate, but creative. Medieval medical theory was based on the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. Winter illnesses were associated with an excess of phlegm, which was considered cold and moist. This actually makes a weird kind of sense if you think about runny noses and coughing up mucus, but their treatments based on this theory were not helpful. For a fever, they might bleed you, because removing blood would supposedly balance your humors. Never mind that you were already weak from illness, let's make you weaker by draining your blood. Sometimes people recovered despite this treatment. Often they didn't. For respiratory issues, they had various herbal remedies. Some of these actually helped a bit. Honey and herbs could soothe a cough. Certain plant infusions had mild anti-inflammatory properties. But they also used things like powdered gems, which did absolutely nothing except waste money. The wealthy would pay for remedies containing ground pearls or gold leaf, believing they had healing properties. Spoiler, they didn't. Poultices were common. You'd make a paste of various substances and plaster it on the affected area. Got chest congestion? Here's a poultice of mustard seed and Lord knows what else, slapped on your chest. It might create a warming sensation, which felt like it was doing something, but mostly it just irritated your skin. For serious illnesses, they might try theriac, which was this legendary cure-all compound that supposedly contained dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh. Yes, really. It was expensive and complicated to make and did basically nothing. But wealthy people swore by it.
Prayers and religious relics were also considered medical treatment. If you were sick, you'd pray to the appropriate saint. Saint Blaise for throat ailments, Saint Roque for the plague, Saint Sebastian for pretty much anything. You might make a pilgrimage to a shrine if you were able, though obviously in winter that was difficult. Or you'd bring in a relic, a saint's bone or a piece of cloth that touched something holy, and pray over it. The church taught illness could be a punishment for sin or a test of faith. So being sick in winter wasn't just physically miserable, it was also spiritually concerning. You'd wonder what you'd done to deserve this. You'd confess your sins, do penance, and hope God would grant you recovery. Monasteries and convents often served as hospitals. Monks and nuns provided care for the sick, which mostly meant giving them a warm place to rest, some food, and praying over them. Sometimes this was enough. Rest and nutrition could help your body fight off illness. Sometimes it wasn't, but it was better than suffering alone in a freezing house. Let's talk about regional differences, because medieval Europe was diverse and winter hit different areas in different ways. If you lived in Scandinavia, winter was long and brutal. We're talking 6 months or more of serious cold and snow. But the thing about Scandinavians is they'd adapted to this over generations. Their houses were built with winter in mind. Thick walls, small windows, efficient hearths. They had better cold weather clothing, better food preservation techniques, a culture built around surviving winter. Norwegian and Swedish farmers would move their livestock into the house for winter. Not kidding. The animals would live in one end of the longhouse, the family in the other.
The animal's body heat helped warm the whole structure. Yes, it smelled terrible. Yes, you were living with your cows and goats, but you were warmer, and you could keep an eye on your valuable livestock. Priorities.
They also had better systems for preserving fish. Dried cod, lutefisk, which is cod preserved in lye. Absolutely disgusting, but it keeps forever. Pickled herring. Coastal communities could rely on fishing even in winter, cutting holes in the ice and fishing through them. Dangerous and cold, but it provided fresh protein. In Iceland, things were even more extreme. Icelandic winters were dark and cold and isolated. Ships couldn't reach the island reliably in winter, so whatever you had was all you were getting until spring. Icelanders preserved everything: fermented shark, pickled sheep parts, dried fish, smoked meats. Their traditional foods sound horrific to modern tastes, but they worked. People survived on them for centuries. In Russia and Eastern Europe, winter was similarly harsh. The Russian winter became legendary for a reason. It was long, dark, and could reach genuinely life-threatening temperatures. Russian architecture adapted with stoves rather than open fireplaces. The Russian stove, or peshka, was a massive masonry structure that heated efficiently and retained warmth for hours. People would sleep on top of these stoves because it was the warmest spot in the house. Eastern European communities also had traditions of communal survival. Villages would work together, sharing resources, helping neighbors. If someone ran out of food, the community would pitch in. This wasn't pure altruism, it was practical. If your neighbor starved, their farm would be abandoned, and that weakened the whole community. Better to share and keep everyone alive. In the Mediterranean regions, Italy, southern France, Spain, Greece, winter was much milder. It still got cold, especially in the mountains, and they still had to deal with food preservation and shorter days, but freezing to death was less of a concern. Their big winter problem was rain. Mediterranean winters are wet, and wet means muddy roads, flooding, damp houses, moldy food stores. Different challenges, but still miserable in their own way. Italy had the advantage of Roman infrastructure that was still partly functional. Some aqueducts still worked, some roads were still maintained. Cities like Venice and Genoa had access to trade goods year-round because their ports didn't freeze. So while Northern Europe was completely isolated in winter, Mediterranean cities could still get supplies by ship, weather permitting. In England, winter was wet and gray more than brutally cold, though it certainly could get cold. The English had to deal with constant damp, which is its own kind of misery. Damp cold feels colder than dry cold. It seeps into your bones. Everything in your house is slightly moist all the time. Clothes don't dry properly. Grain stores mold. It's depressing and uncomfortable. English manor houses tried to combat this with lots of fires and lots of ale. Ale was safer to drink than water, provided calories, and if you drank enough of it, you cared less about being cold and damp. Medieval England ran on ale. Everyone drank it, all day, starting with breakfast. It was weak ale, usually, not enough alcohol to get you drunk off a single cup, but over the course of a day you'd maintain a mild buzz. This was considered normal and appropriate. In the mountains, the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Carpathians, winter was particularly harsh. Mountain communities would be completely snowed in for months. Avalanches were a real threat. Some villages wouldn't see outsiders from November to April. They had to be completely self-sufficient. Mountain folk developed their own strategies. They'd stockpile food aggressively. They'd preserve everything possible. They'd keep their livestock very close, often in structures attached to their homes. They'd hunted and foraged extensively in autumn to build up supplies, and they'd just hunker down and wait it out.
Being snowed in meant that if something went wrong, if someone got seriously injured or ill, if a house burned down, if food ran out, there was no help coming. You dealt with it yourself, or you didn't survive. This created tight-knit communities where everyone relied on each other, but it also meant that a bad winter could devastate a mountain village with no possibility of outside aid. Now let's talk about some specific winters that were catastrophically bad, because every so often Mother Nature decided that regular medieval winter wasn't quite miserable enough.
The winter of 1309 to 1310 was terrible across Europe. It was part of a period of extreme weather that contributed to the Great Famine that would strike a few years later. This winter was exceptionally long and cold. Rivers froze solid, including rivers that rarely froze. The Thames in London froze enough that people could walk across it. Sounds fun, right? Ice festivals and skating? No. It meant trade stopped. Ships couldn't move. Goods couldn't be transported. Cities started running out of supplies. The cold killed crops that were supposed to winter over. Fruit trees died. Grapevines died. This meant failures in the next harvest, which meant less food the following winter. It was a cascading disaster. Livestock died in huge numbers. Animals that were already weakened from poor feed just couldn't handle the extreme cold. Farmers would wake up to find their animals frozen. Each dead animal was a catastrophe that represented meat, milk, labor, wealth. Losing your oxen meant you couldn't plow come spring. Losing your cows meant no dairy. These losses rippled forward for years. People died too. The chroniclers of the time recorded mass deaths from cold and hunger. Exact numbers are impossible to know, but the death toll was significant. And this set the stage for the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which was arguably the worst famine in European history. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. The winter of 1322 to 1323 was another nightmare. Extreme cold again, following a bad harvest. Food was already scarce before winter hit, and then the cold made everything worse. People were already weakened from hunger, which made them more vulnerable to illness. Typhus and other diseases swept through malnourished populations. Entire families died. This is when you start seeing records of people doing desperate things, eating grass and tree bark, abandoning children they couldn't feed. Increased crime as people stole food to survive. Some reports even mention cannibalism, though these are hard to verify and might have been exaggerated. But the fact that chroniclers were writing about it tells you how bad things got.
The winter of 1407-1408 was brutal in Northern Europe. Scandinavia and the Baltic regions were hit especially hard. The Baltic Sea froze solid, which almost never happened. You could supposedly walk from Denmark to Sweden across the ice. Again, this sounds magical, but it was disastrous for trade and fishing communities. In 1432, another terrible winter struck. This one was recorded as having snow so deep in some areas that entire houses were buried. People were trapped inside, digging tunnels through snow to reach their animals or their neighbors. Food ran out. Firewood ran out. Spring was late that year, extending the misery well into what should have been thaw season. In 1564-65 was at the beginning of the Little Ice Age's worst period. This was technically early modern rather than medieval, but it's worth mentioning because it shows how bad things could get. Rivers across Europe froze, crops failed, famine followed, and this became the new normal for a while. colder winters, shorter growing seasons, regular food shortages. During these catastrophic winters, social structures would strain and sometimes break down. The normal rules stopped applying when people were starving. Peasants would poach from their lords' forests or game preserves, which was normally a serious crime. Lords would sometimes look the other way, because what were they going to do? Execute half the village? They needed those peasants alive to work the land. Cities suffered differently than rural areas. Cities depended on food being brought in from the countryside. In a bad winter, roads became impassable. Rivers that normally transported goods were frozen or flooded. Food supplies dwindled and prices skyrocketed. The urban poor starved, while merchants hoarded grain, waiting for prices to rise even further. City governments sometimes tried to intervene, setting price controls or forcing merchants to sell, but this often made things worse. Merchants would hide their supplies rather than sell at a loss. Riots happened. Hungry people would storm grain stores or bakeries, taking what they needed. Authorities would crack down, which led to executions, which just added to the death toll and misery. It was a cycle with no good solutions. The church played a complicated role during these crisis winters. On one hand, monasteries and church institutions did provide charity. They'd distribute food to the poor, offer shelter, care for the sick. Many religious institutions took their duty to care for the less fortunate seriously, and they saved lives. On the other hand, the church was also a major landowner and grain holder. Church estates sometimes hoarded supplies just like secular lords. And the church's explanation for suffering, that it was God's will, a punishment for sin, a test of faith, wasn't exactly helpful when you were starving. But people found comfort in religion anyway. When everything else was falling apart, faith gave you something to hold on to. The rituals and routines of religious life provided structure. Saints' days and holy days gave you something to mark time by, something to anticipate. The promise of heaven made earthly suffering feel more bearable. If this life is just a brief trial before eternal paradise, well, you can endure a lot. Winter religious practices were important. Advent, the period leading up to Christmas, was technically a time of fasting and penance. In practice, people were already eating poorly in winter, so the fasting wasn't much different from regular life. But the focus on anticipation, on waiting for the coming of Christ, paralleled the waiting for spring. You were waiting for light to return, for warmth, for new life. The symbolism worked. Christmas, as we mentioned, was the big celebration, but there were other important winter holy days. St. Stephen's Day on December 26th, the Feast of the Holy Innocents on December 28th, New Year's Day, Epiphany on January 6th, these gave structure to the darkest part of winter. Candlemas on February 2nd was particularly significant. This was when the Christmas season officially ended, and it was a celebration of light. People would bring candles to church to be blessed, and these blessed candles were believed to have protective properties. You'd light them during storms or when someone was ill. It was a way of holding on to light in the dark season.
And Candlemas was also when people tried to predict how much longer winter would last. If it was sunny on Candlemas, that meant more winter ahead. If it was cloudy, spring would come early. This is the origin of Groundhog Day, actually. Same folk tradition, different culture. Lent began in late winter or early spring, depending on when Easter fell. Lent meant fasting, no meat, simplifying your diet. But honestly, late winter diet was already pretty simple and meat-free for most people because you were running out of everything. So Lent just formalized what was already happening out of necessity. Let's talk about childbirth in winter, because that was its own special kind of nightmare. Women didn't stop getting pregnant just because winter was coming. If you conceived in spring, you'd give birth in winter. And giving birth in a freezing house with no modern medicine was incredibly dangerous. Childbirth was already the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age in medieval times. Add winter conditions, and it got worse. The cold increased risks of complications. Infections were more likely in close, unsanitary quarters. If there were complications requiring a midwife or physician, they might not be able to reach you due to weather. Midwives did their best. They had herbal remedies to ease labor, techniques passed down through generations, prayers and blessings. But when something went seriously wrong, there often wasn't anything they could do. Women died in childbirth. Babies died. Sometimes both died. It was tragically common.
If mother and baby both survived, keeping the infant alive through winter was the next challenge. Newborns can't regulate their body temperature well. A cold house was dangerous for them. Mothers would keep the baby wrapped constantly, often sleeping with the infant to share body heat. This occasionally led to accidental smothering, which was heartbreaking, but also prosecuted as a crime in some jurisdictions, which was just cruel. Breastfeeding was crucial because there was no safe alternative, but if the mother was malnourished, which was likely in late winter, her milk supply could be inadequate. Wet nurses were an option for wealthy families, but poor families just had to hope for the best. Many babies didn't make it through their first winter. Churches would baptize infants as quickly as possible, often within days or even hours of birth. This wasn't just for religious reasons. It was because infant mortality was so high that you wanted to ensure the baby's soul was saved before they potentially died. It was grim pragmatism dressed up as piety. Death in winter presented its own logistical problems. Burying the dead was difficult when the ground was frozen solid. You couldn't just dig a grave in frozen earth, so bodies would sometimes have to be kept above ground until the thaw. Churches had charnel houses where bodies could be stored, or a body might be kept in an outbuilding, frozen naturally by the cold until burial was possible. Some communities would dig graves in advance in late autumn before the ground froze, just to have them ready. Cheerful thought, right? But it was practical. People died in winter. You needed somewhere to put them. The frozen ground meant that disease couldn't spread as easily from buried bodies, which was actually an advantage. In summer, improper burial could contaminate water sources and spread illness. Winter burials, even delayed ones, were somewhat safer in that regard.
Funeral practices continued despite the cold. People would gather to mourn, hold wakes, pray for the deceased. These rituals were important for the community, a way of processing grief and supporting each other. And honestly, funerals were also social events. It was an excuse to gather, to break the isolation of winter, to share food and drink and stories. Speaking of isolation, the psychological toll of winter was significant. We think of seasonal affective disorder as a modern diagnosis, but medieval people absolutely experienced it. Months of darkness, cold, confinement, poor diet, illness, watching people die, it's depressing. There's no other word for it. People got irritable and short-tempered. Cabin fever was real. Families stuck together in one room for months on end would get on each other's nerves. Arguments, resentments, domestic disputes all increased in winter. Village records show higher rates of interpersonal conflicts in winter months. Some people just gave up. Depression and despair could be overwhelming. Suicide rates may have increased in winter, though records are unclear because the church condemned suicide and families would try to hide it. Others turned to drink. Ale and wine were available, and drinking helped numb the misery. Drunkenness was common and often tolerated because what else were you going to do? This could lead to other problems, accidents, arguments, poor decisions, but in the moment, alcohol made things feel more bearable. Communities tried to combat the isolation and depression with social activities, gathering at the tavern or the church hall, storytelling nights, music and singing. These weren't just entertainment, they were mental health interventions, even if people didn't think of them that way.
Work continued as much as possible, partly out of necessity and partly to maintain routine and purpose. Men would do repairs, craft items, maintain tools. Women would spin, weave, sew, preserve foods, prepare for spring. Keeping busy helped pass the time and gave you a sense of accomplishment. Children were harder to keep occupied. They couldn't play outside much in the coldest months. They'd get restless and bored. Parents would tell stories, teach skills, assign small tasks. But mostly children just had to learn to be patient and deal with boredom. Not the worst lesson, honestly. Teenagers and young adults had it particularly hard. They had energy and restlessness and not much outlet for it. Romances would develop just because there wasn't much else interesting happening. Marriages were often negotiated in winter and performed in late spring or summer, so winter was courting season, for better or worse. Let's talk about animals, because they suffered too, and their suffering affected humans. Livestock keeping in winter was precarious. Animals needed food, water, and shelter, all of which were challenging to provide. Hay and grain for fodder had to be stored from the harvest. If you didn't store enough, or if it got wet and moldy, your animals would starve. Water was a constant problem. Natural water sources froze. You'd have to break ice on troughs and ponds daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Some people would bring snow into the barn and let it melt, but this required heat, which meant fire, which in a barn full of dry hay was risky.
Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, they all needed care. Cows had to be milked daily, even in winter, though they produced less milk in the cold months. Sheep needed to be checked for problems. Pigs would eat almost anything, which was useful, but they still needed something to eat. Chickens laid fewer eggs in winter, but still needed feeding. Horses and oxen were crucial for farm labor and transport. Keeping them healthy through winter was essential. They needed more feed in cold weather to maintain body heat. They needed proper shelter. Losing a working animal was devastating because you probably couldn't afford to replace it. Sometimes animals had to be slaughtered midwinter out of necessity. If you ran out of fodder and couldn't keep them fed, better to slaughter them and preserve the meat than watch them starve. This was a hard decision because it meant fewer animals come spring, but sometimes there was no choice. Wild animals struggled too. Wolves, driven by hunger, would venture closer to human settlements. This was dangerous for livestock and occasionally for people, especially children. Wolf attacks weren't common, but they happened.
Communities would organize hunts to kill wolves near villages, both for safety and because it gave men something to do. Deer, boars, rabbits, they were all starving in winter too. Poaching increased because hungry people saw hungry animals and thought, why not? Technically, game belonged to the Lord. Practically, if you could catch it without getting caught, you had meat. The risk of punishment versus the certainty of hunger was a calculation many people made. Birds suffered. Many species migrated, which medieval people noticed but didn't really understand. They'd come up with various explanations. Birds buried themselves in mud and hibernated, or they flew to the moon, or they transformed into different animals. The idea that they just flew south apparently was too straightforward.
The birds that stayed had a rough time. Food was scarce. The cold killed many of them. People might put out scraps, not out of kindness particularly, because having birds around meant they'd eat insects and pests come spring. Cats and dogs were working animals, not really pets in the modern sense. Cats caught mice and rats, which was essential for protecting grain stores. Dogs guarded property, helped with hunting, and assisted with herding livestock. They were valuable, so they'd be fed and sheltered, but affection for them was considered a bit odd. They were useful, not family members. Though, of course, people being people, they did get attached to their animals anyway. There are records of people mourning deceased pets, naming their animals, treating them with obvious affection. We're not that different, really. Mice and rats thrived in winter because they lived in human structures, eating human food stores. They were a constant battle. Cats helped, but couldn't eliminate them entirely. You'd just accept that you were sharing your grain with rodents and hope they didn't take too much. If they got into your winter stores and contaminated or ate a significant portion, that could mean the difference between making it to spring or not. Insects were less of a problem in winter, thankfully. Fleas and lice didn't disappear entirely, but they were less active. People were still infested with various parasites, head lice, body lice, intestinal worms, but at least you weren't dealing with swarms of flies and mosquitoes on top of everything else. Small mercies. Let's talk about water and sanitation, because winter made these essential things even more complicated.
Getting clean water in winter was difficult. Wells could freeze, streams and rivers froze. You'd have to break through ice to get water, which was hard work. And once you got the water back to your house, you had to be careful it didn't freeze before you used it. Melting snow was an option, but it takes a lot of snow to make a useful amount of water, and you needed heat to melt it, which meant fuel. Still, in a heavy snow, you'd collect clean snow and melt it for drinking and cooking. Just had to make sure you weren't using yellow snow. Medieval people weren't stupid. Bathing was rare anyway in medieval times, and in winter it was even rarer. Heating enough water for a bath was a huge expenditure of resources. Most people didn't fully bathe from November to March. They might wash their face and hands, maybe their feet occasionally, but a full body wash? Unlikely. This is where the stereotype of medieval people being filthy comes from, and it's not entirely unfair. People were dirty. They smelled bad. But in their defense, being clean was genuinely difficult, and they had other priorities, like not freezing or starving. The wealthy could afford to bathe more regularly. They had servants to haul and heat water. They had private chambers where they could bathe in relative comfort. But even they weren't bathing daily, maybe once a week or every 2 weeks if they were fastidious. Laundry was a major undertaking in winter. You needed large amounts of water, heat, and time. Clothes had to be washed, rinsed, and dried. Drying in winter was nearly impossible. There was no sun, everything was damp.
Hanging clothes outside meant they'd freeze solid. You'd have to dry things indoors near the fire, which took forever and meant your house smelled like wet wool.
So laundry happened infrequently. You'd wear your clothes until they were genuinely filthy, then wash them all at once, maybe once a month or less. This is another reason everyone smelled bad. You were wearing the same unwashed clothes for weeks, sweating in them, sleeping in them, living in them. Sanitation was primitive. Wealthy houses might have a garderobe, which was basically a little room with a hole in the floor that led to a cesspit, or, if you were very fancy, straight out the side of the castle wall. Peasants had outhouses if they were lucky, or just a designated spot outside if they weren't. Going to the bathroom in winter meant going outside into the freezing cold, or using the chamber pot inside, and then having to empty it outside. Neither option was pleasant. Chamber pots were just buckets, basically, and they smelled horrible. You'd empty them in the morning into the cesspit or midden heap. Toilet paper didn't exist. People used leaves, moss, straw, or old cloth rags. In winter, you used whatever you had that was soft-ish and available. Delicacy prevents me from going into more detail, but use your imagination. The smell inside medieval houses in winter must have been incredible. Unwashed bodies, chamber pots, smoke, cooking smells, animals if they were housed inside, damp wool, rotting rushes on the floor. It was a symphony of stench. People got used to it. They had to. Everyone smelled, so it became background noise. The wealthy tried to combat smells with herbs and spices. They'd scatter sweet-smelling herbs on the floors, burn incense, use perfumes and scented oils. This helped a little, but mostly just added floral notes to the underlying funk. Monasteries and convents were probably the cleanest places, relatively speaking. Religious communities often had better sanitation systems, rules about cleanliness, and the resources to maintain them. Monks would bathe more regularly than lay people, wash their habits, keep their spaces cleaner. This was partly piety, cleanliness being next to godliness and all, and partly practical. Diseases spread in close quarters, and monasteries wanted to keep their communities healthy. But even in the cleanest monastery, winter was still cold and dark and uncomfortable. Monastic life was deliberately austere. Many orders forbade excessive heating or comfortable bedding as a form of self-denial. So monks were choosing to suffer through winter as a spiritual practice. At least they were fed regularly and had a roof over their heads, which was more than many people could say. Let's touch on cities versus rural areas, because the winter experience was different depending on where you lived. Rural peasants had the advantage of access to food sources. You raised your own animals, grew your own grain, knew where to forage. If you'd prepared well, you could be somewhat self-sufficient. But you were also isolated, vulnerable to weather and crop failures, and had little recourse if things went wrong. Cities had more resources in some ways. Markets, even in winter, where you could buy food if you had money. More skilled craftspeople, including physicians. Churches and monasteries providing charity, entertainment and social opportunities. But cities were also crowded, which spread disease faster. Food had to be brought in, making you dependent on supply chains. And if you were poor in a city, you might be worse off than a peasant because you had no land, no way to produce food yourself. Urban workers, craftsmen, laborers, servants, depended on employment. Winter slowed many trades. Construction basically stopped because you can't work with stone and mortar in freezing weather. Shipping and transport were reduced. This meant less work available, which meant less money, which meant harder times. Some urban trades actually increased in winter. Tailors and seamstresses stayed busy making and repairing warm clothes. Chandlers sold more candles. Firewood sellers had steady business. Alehouses and taverns were social hubs and did good business. But for many workers, winter meant underemployment and poverty. Cities also had to deal with infrastructure problems. Streets became muddy morasses when it rained, or frozen ruts when it was cold. Sanitation systems, such as they were, would freeze or overflow. Water supplies could freeze. Fire was a constant danger in cities where buildings were packed together, and winter meant more fires for heating and light, increasing the risk. And if fire broke out in winter, fighting it was harder. Water for dousing the flames might be frozen. Response was slower because of weather. Fires could devastate entire neighborhoods. After a major fire in winter, the survivors would be left without shelter in the worst possible season. Cities did have better organized charity systems. Guilds would take care of their members who fell on hard times. Churches ran hospitals and distributed alms. Wealthy individuals might endow charitable institutions. So there were safety nets, though they were far from adequate for everyone who needed help. Crime rates in cities fluctuated with the seasons. Theft increased in winter as people got desperate. Robbery and burglary were ways to survive when you had no other options. City authorities would crack down, but they also understood the desperation driving it. Punishments might be harsh for serious crimes, but petty theft might be overlooked, especially if the thief was clearly starving. Prostitution continued year-round. It was illegal in theory, but tolerated in practice in most medieval cities. Brothels provided employment for women who had few other options, and they served a social function that authorities recognized. In winter, business might actually increase as people sought warmth and comfort and distraction from the bleakness.
Let's talk about the weird superstitions and folklore around winter, because medieval people had lots of beliefs about the season. Winter was associated with death and darkness, obviously. The world seemed to be dying. Plants were dead, animals hibernated or migrated. Everything was cold and still. This fed into beliefs about spirits and supernatural entities being more active. The wild hunt was a common folk belief across much of northern Europe. This was a spectral hunting party that rode through the sky during winter storms, led by various figures depending on the region. Odin in Scandinavia, the devil in Christian areas, ancient kings in others. Hearing the wild hunt was an omen of disaster. Seeing it could drive you mad or kill you, or result in your being kidnapped and taken to the underworld. Was it real? Of course not. But wind howling through bare trees on a dark winter night can sound like horses and hounds and horns if you're primed to hear it. And believing in the wild hunt gave people an explanation for the fear and unease that winter darkness produced. Ghosts and spirits were thought to be more active in winter. The boundary between the living and dead worlds was thin. This is why Christmas season included a lot of protective rituals and blessings. You were warding off spiritual threats as much as celebrating a holy day. Certain nights were considered particularly dangerous. St. Thomas's Eve, midwinter, Twelfth Night. These were times when spirits walked, when magic was possible, when you needed to be careful. People would perform protective rituals, hanging herbs, making the sign of the cross, saying prayers,
avoiding going outside after dark.
Weather divination was common. People would watch for signs that predicted how long winter would last or how severe it would be. The thickness of animal fur, the timing of first snow, the behavior of birds, all of these were read for meaning. Most of it was nonsense, but sometimes folk wisdom actually tracked with genuine patterns. There were also beliefs about winter being a time when the normal rules didn't apply. The 12 days of Christmas were a period of reversal and license. Servants might be served by their masters. Men might dress as women. Pranks and mischief were tolerated. This was a pressure valve, letting people blow off steam before returning to regular hierarchies. Midwinter celebrations often had pre-Christian roots that the church had Christianized but never fully eliminated. Burning the Yule log, decorating with evergreens, feasting and drinking, these had pagan origins. The church incorporated them into Christmas celebrations, but the old meanings lingered. Evergreens were symbols of life persisting through winter. Burning logs represented the sun's warmth. Feasting was sympathic magic. Eat abundantly now to ensure abundance later. Some folklore was practical wisdom dressed up in supernatural terms. Don't travel in storms, or the wild hunt will get you. Stay indoors at night, or evil spirits will snatch you. These kept people safe, even if the reasoning was faulty. Ice and snow were mysterious. People didn't understand freezing and thawing the way we do. Ice was magical in its way. Water turned solid, transformed into something you could walk on. Snowflakes were called God's flowers in some regions, each one unique and intricate. These were wonders in a world without scientific explanations. Icicles hanging from roofs were beautiful, but also dangerous. A falling icicle could genuinely hurt or even end you if it was large enough and you were unlucky. So there were warnings about walking under them, framed as superstitions, but based in real risk.
And finally, let's talk about the anticipation of spring, because that's what got people through winter. From about February onwards, people were watching desperately for signs of spring. The first buds on trees, birds returning from migration, the weather warming slightly. Any indication that winter was ending was celebrated. Candlemas in early February was a milestone. Then came Lent, which meant spring was approaching. Easter was a movable feast, falling somewhere between late March and early April, and it represented rebirth and renewal perfectly. By Easter, you were usually out of the worst of winter, even if it wasn't fully warm yet. People would start preparing for spring work even while winter still held on, repairing tools, planning planting, checking over seeds saved from last harvest. There was hope now. You'd made it through the worst. Survival was likely. The first day warm enough to work outside comfortably was a relief beyond description. Imagine being cooped up, cold for months, and then finally stepping outside into sunshine and warmth. Your whole body would relax. The psychological weight would lift. Spring planting was hard work, but it was hopeful work. You were creating the food that would sustain you through next winter. The cycle continued. You'd survived another winter, and with luck, you'd survive the next one too.
And that was life. Year after year, winter after winter. You endured it because you had no choice. You made it through with determination, community support, faith, and sheer stubbornness. Medieval people were tougher than we give them credit for. They lived through conditions we can barely imagine, with minimal resources and no guarantees. Winter tried to end them every single year, and every single year enough of them survived to continue on. So, the next time you're complaining about your heating bill or scraping frost off your windshield, take a moment to appreciate how much easier we have it. Central heating, electric lights, grocery stores, modern medicine, insulated homes, weather forecasts, appropriate clothing. We're living in unprecedented comfort. Medieval winter was survival. Our winter is mild inconvenience. And honestly, that's something to be grateful for as you drift off to sleep in your warm, comfortable bed. Sweet dreams.
All right, let's ease back into this frozen world and talk about what actual daily life looked like for different people during medieval winter. Because, as you might imagine, a king's winter and a peasant's winter were very, very different experiences, though both were still cold. Stone castles don't care about your royal blood when it comes to temperature. Let's start with the peasants, because that's what most people were. Something like 90% of the medieval population worked the land. So, statistically, if you were alive in medieval Europe, you were probably a peasant, and your winter routine was dictated by survival, daylight, and the weather. You'd wake up before dawn, or what would be dawn if the sun ever decided to show up. In deep winter, this might be around 7 or 8 in the morning, because there was no point getting up earlier when you couldn't see anything anyway. Your house was cold. The fire had burned down overnight to just coals. Someone, usually the woman of the house or an older child, would get up first and revive the fire. This was priority one. No fire meant no warmth, no cooking, no life. While the fire was being rebuilt, everyone else stayed in bed as long as possible because bed was the warmest place you had. Eventually, though, you had to get up and face the day. You'd emerge from under your pile of blankets, still wearing yesterday's clothes because you never took them off, and shuffle toward the fire. Breakfast was simple: leftover pottage heated up, maybe some bread if you had it. Ale to drink, because everyone drank ale all the time, children included. It was safer than water and provided calories. The ale you had in winter was probably from autumn brewing, getting a bit stale, but it was fine. You weren't drinking for pleasure, you were drinking for hydration and calories. After breakfast, the work began. Men would bundle up in their cloaks and head outside to tend animals. This was daily, no matter the weather. Animals needed feeding, watering, checking. Cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, they all needed care. You'd break ice on water troughs. You'd distribute hay or whatever fodder you had. You'd check that no animals had died overnight. If one had, you'd have to deal with the carcass. Butcher it immediately if the meat was still good, or dispose of it if it wasn't.
Mucking out animal shelters was ongoing winter work. Animals produce waste constantly, and it builds up. You couldn't just ignore it, because the resulting filth would make the animals sick. So you'd shovel out manure, pile it in a midden heap, and put down fresh straw. This was cold, smelly, miserable work, but it had to be done. Repairing things was constant. Fences, walls, roofs, tools, everything broke or wore out, and winter was when you had time to fix it. You couldn't work the fields in winter
so instead you maintained everything else. You'd thatch any gaps in your roof. You'd reinforce walls. You'd repair your plow and other tools, getting them ready for spring. If you had firewood left to cut, you'd do that. Chopping wood in winter was hard because frozen wood is harder to split, but you needed fuel, so you did it. Each swing of the axe warmed you up a bit, which was nice, until you stopped and immediately started freezing again. By midday, you'd come back inside for dinner, which was the main meal of the day. More pottage. Maybe you'd added some dried peas or beans. Maybe there was cheese, bread if you had it. It was all very beige and very boring, but it was warm food, and that counted for something. Afternoons meant more of the same. More repairs, more animal care, more gathering wood or water. As the sun started setting, which it did depressingly early, you'd finish up outside work and come back in for good. Supper was light, whatever was left from dinner, more ale. Then you'd sit by the fire for a bit. This was family time, not because of any sentimental notion, but because there was nothing else to do. You'd talk, tell stories, maybe sing. Work on small tasks that could be done indoors, sharpening tools, mending clothes, working on crafts.
Children would be there, being children, restless, bored, getting on everyone's nerves. Parents would tell them stories, teach them skills, or just tell them to sit still and be quiet. Discipline was straightforward. You did what you were told, or you got smacked. Gentle parenting wasn't really a thing yet. If you were very lucky, a traveling storyteller or musician might pass through your village. This was entertainment beyond measure. Everyone would gather to listen. Stories were how news spread, how history was remembered, how people escaped their daily reality for a bit. A good storyteller was worth feeding and housing for the night. But most nights there was no entertainment. Just your family, the fire, and the darkness pressing in from outside. You'd go to bed early because what else were you going to do? Conserve your candles, conserve your firewood. Sleep. Sleep was free, and it passed the time. Women's work in winter was different but equally constant. While men worked outside, women worked inside. Spinning was a major winter task. You'd take raw wool, cleaned and carded, and spin it into thread using a drop spindle, or, if you were lucky, a spinning wheel. This was endless, repetitive work. You could do it while sitting by the fire, while watching children, while talking. Your hands just worked automatically. The thread you spun would eventually be woven into cloth, either you if you had a loom, or by a professional weaver. This cloth would become clothing, blankets, household textiles. It was valuable. Fabric was expensive, so making your own was economically essential. Sewing and mending were ongoing. Clothes wore out, they tore, they got holes, they frayed. You'd patch them, darn them, reinforce them. Nothing was thrown away while it could still be repaired. You'd wear something until it was literally falling apart, then you'd repurpose the fabric for something else. Waste nothing.
Food preparation took up a lot of time. Even though your diet was simple, you still had to grind grain into flour, make bread, prepare pottage, manage your preserved foods. Bread baking was a big production. You'd make large batches and bake them in a communal village oven if there was one, or in your own hearth if you had the setup. The bread had to last for days, so you made dense, heavy loaves that wouldn't spoil quickly. Managing the household was the woman's domain. Keeping the fire going, managing food supplies, making sure there was water, keeping the living space as clean as possible, which wasn't very clean, but you tried. Supervising children, caring for the sick or elderly, handling the million small tasks that kept a household functioning. And if you were pregnant, you did all of this while pregnant. If you had an infant, you did it while caring for an infant. If you were sick, you did it while sick. There was no time off. Work didn't stop just because you felt bad. Now let's shift up the social ladder a bit. Skilled craftspeople and urban workers had a different winter experience. If you were a craftsman, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a shoemaker, a baker, winter meant less work in some ways, but also more concentrated work in others. Construction stopped, which meant carpenters and masons had less employment. But indoor crafts continued. You'd work in your workshop, which might have a small forge or hearth for heat. Blacksmiths stayed busy. Tools always needed repair or replacement. Horseshoes, nails, hinges, all the metal goods that kept society functioning. The forge provided heat, which was nice, but working metal in winter meant the contrast between the hot forge and cold air was extreme. You'd be sweating from the heat of your work, but the moment you stepped away, you'd be freezing.
Bakers worked year-round. People needed bread regardless of season. Bakeries were warm from the ovens, which made them popular gathering spots. People would bring their own dough to be baked in the baker's oven, paying a fee. The heat, the smell of baking bread, the social atmosphere. Bakeries were pleasant places in winter. Ale houses and taverns were busy in winter. People wanted somewhere warm to gather, and alcohol helped numb the misery. Tavern keepers sold ale, wine if available, simple food. They provided a fire, some light, a space to socialize. Gambling happened, which was technically illegal, but widely practiced. Dice games, cards, betting on whatever. It passed the time and offered the possibility of winning some money. Prostitutes worked the taverns and streets. It wasn't glamorous work, especially in winter. Cold streets, rough customers, constant risk. But it was employment, and for women without other options, it was survival. Cities usually had designated areas for prostitution. The authorities knew where it happened and mostly looked the other way as long as it stayed in those areas. Merchants had a harder time in winter. Trade slowed because transport was difficult. Roads were muddy or icy. Ships couldn't sail in storms or when harbors froze. So merchants would wait out the winter, living off savings, maintaining their goods, planning for spring when trade would resume. Some luxury goods merchants stayed busy because wealthy people wanted exotic items for Christmas and winter celebrations. Spices, fine fabrics, jewelry, books. These had a market among the nobility even in winter. But bulk goods, grain, wool, timber, basic commodities, those trades mostly paused. Guilds members had some protection in winter. Guilds were like unions. They regulated their trade, controlled who could practice it, and provided support for members who fell on hard times. If you were a guild member and you got sick or injured, the guild might provide some assistance. Not generous assistance, but something. It was a safety net.
Apprentices and servants had it rough. You were at the bottom of the hierarchy, doing the worst jobs for minimal pay. Servants might have room and board provided, which was actually valuable in winter. A place to sleep, regular meals, some warmth. That was better than many people had. But you worked constantly at your master's beck and call for little freedom or compensation. Now let's talk about the nobility, because their winter was a completely different world. If you were a noble, winter meant retreating to your main residence. Lords had multiple properties often, but in winter you'd settle into your primary castle or manor house for the season. Travel was difficult, so you stayed put. Your castle was still cold, we've covered this, but you had resources to make it more bearable. Multiple fireplaces, better clothing, plenty of food, servants to handle everything. You weren't comfortable by modern standards, but you were vastly more comfortable than peasants. Your day started later than a peasant's. You had servants to handle the fire and prepare breakfast. You'd wake in your bedchamber, which had been warmed by a servant with a brazier of hot coals. You'd get dressed, or rather servants would dress you, in multiple layers of fine wool and linen, maybe fur-lined. Breakfast for the nobility was more elaborate. Bread made from fine white flour, not coarse dark bread. Meat, maybe, cheese, eggs, ale or wine. You ate well because you could afford it.
Morning might be spent handling estate business. As a lord, you managed lands and the people on them. Even in winter, there were decisions to make, disputes to settle, accounts to review. Your steward would report on supplies, on tenant issues, on maintenance needs. You'd make decisions and give orders. Religious observance was part of daily life. You'd attend Mass in your private chapel if you had one, or in the local church if you didn't. This wasn't optional. Piety was expected, and also church was a social obligation. You'd see and be seen, maintain your status, fulfill your religious duties. Afternoons might involve hunting if the weather allowed. Hunting was a noble privilege and a major winter activity. Deer, boar, birds, these were hunted both for sport and for food. Hunting in winter was challenging, which made it more prestigious. You'd ride out with your household knights and retainers, with dogs and hawks, making a whole production of it. Hunting provided fresh meat, which was valuable in winter, and it gave you something to do. Nobles were warrior class. They needed to maintain their skills and their status. Hunting did both. It was practice for warfare, demonstration of prowess, and a way to break the monotony. If weather prevented hunting, you'd find other ways to pass time. Hawking could be done in lighter weather. Chess was popular among educated nobles. Board games, dice games, cards. Reading, if you were literate, which not all nobles were. Having books read to you if you weren't. Music and entertainment were part of noble life. You might employ a household minstrel, or traveling entertainers would visit. Musicians, singers, storytellers, jugglers, acrobats. Entertainment was important. It filled the long winter evenings and demonstrated your wealth and patronage.
Feasts were regular events. The nobility feasted often in winter, partly for celebration, partly for social bonding, partly because they could. A feast meant multiple courses, lots of meat, wine, entertainment. Your household, important retainers, local lesser nobles would attend. It was politics and pleasure combined. Women of the nobility had their own routines. They managed the household, which was a big job even with servants. They supervised food preparation, household maintenance, servants' work. They did fine needlework, embroidery, which was both practical and artistic.
They socialized with other noblewomen, managing the complex web of relationships and alliances. Noblewomen also had religious duties. Charity was expected. You'd distribute alms to the poor, especially in winter. This was partly Christian obligation, partly social expectation. A noblewoman who was generous and pious enhanced her family's reputation. Education happened in winter. Noble children would have tutors. Boys learned to read and write, study Latin, learn history and literature. They also trained in combat, riding, hunting, the skills of their class. Girls learned reading, household management, music, needlework. Some learned Latin and classical literature. It varied by family and region. Pages and squires, young nobles serving in other households as part of their education, continued their training in winter. They'd practice combat indoors when possible, study etiquette and courtly behavior, serve at table, attend to their lord. It was an apprenticeship in being noble. Evening meant supper, which was usually lighter than the midday dinner, then more socializing by the fire, games, music, conversation. The great hall would be the warmest room with a large fire and all the household gathered. You'd stay up later than peasants because you had better light and more to do.
When you finally went to bed, your chamber would have been warmed. Your bed would have curtains to trap heat. You'd have feather mattresses and down coverlets. A servant might sleep in your room to attend to any needs during the night. Comfort was relative, but you had far more of it than most people. The royal court was the extreme end of the nobility spectrum. Kings and queens had even more elaborate routines, more servants, more entertainment, more of everything. But they were also dealing with politics constantly. Winter was when courts would settle into their winter residences and nobles would gather for the season. This made winter courts politically intense. Everyone who mattered was in one place with time on their hands. Alliances were formed, plots were hatched, marriages were negotiated. The social maneuvering was constant and complex. One wrong move could mean losing royal favor, which could mean losing lands, titles, income. Queens had their own courts and routines. They managed the royal household, which was enormous. They presided over social events. They pursued their own political agendas. They were pregnant fairly often, because pregnancy in medieval times was dangerous, even with the best care available. Royal children had their own households, separate from their parents often. They'd be educated by the best tutors available, raised with elaborate ceremony, prepared for their future roles. Even royal children got cold in winter, though. Stone palaces were drafty for everyone. Let's talk about monks and nuns, because their winter experience was unique. Monastic life was highly structured, and winter didn't change that much. Monks and nuns followed a strict schedule of prayer, work, and rest that continued regardless of season. The divine office meant praying at set times throughout the day and night. Matins in the middle of the night, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, 8 prayer services every single day. Getting up for matins in winter meant getting up in the coldest, darkest part of the night and going to an unheated church to pray. This was deliberate austerity. Suffering was spiritually valuable. You were mortifying the flesh, denying worldly comfort, focusing on God. Many monastic orders forbade heating in certain spaces. The church was never heated. The cloister might not be heated. Dormitories were unheated.
Only specific rooms like the warming room and the infirmary would have fires. So monks and nuns were cold constantly. This was part of the deal. Embrace suffering, reject comfort. They did have some advantages, though. Monasteries were built to last, with good stone construction. They had organized food supplies with proper storage and preservation. They had infirmaries for sick members with some actual medical knowledge and herbal treatments. They had communal support. The work that monks did in winter changed a bit. Field work stopped, but there was still plenty to do. Manuscript copying and illumination was major monastic work, and winter was actually good for this. The cold helped preserve the inks and parchment. Monasteries had scriptoriums where monks would copy texts, creating the manuscripts that preserved ancient knowledge. This was painstaking work. You sat at a desk with your parchment, your quill, your ink. Your fingers would get stiff from cold, making the work harder. The light was poor, so you worked near windows during the day or by candlelight in evening. You'd copy texts letter by letter, hour after hour, day after day. It was tedious but important work.
Other monks worked in kitchens, bakeries, breweries, gardens, even in winter. Monastic communities were self-sufficient, ideally. They grew their own food, baked their own bread, brewed their own ale. Winter meant preserved foods and stored grain, but the work continued. Nuns had similar routines, but often did more textile work. Convents produced embroidery, vestments, altar cloths. This was skilled work and also a source of income. Wealthy patrons would commission elaborate pieces, and nuns would spend months creating them. Monastic meals were simple, especially in winter. Lent-style restrictions applied to many orders year-round. No meat, simple foods, limited quantities. You'd eat bread, pottage, vegetables, fish if available. Meals were taken in silence while someone read aloud from religious texts. This was eating as necessity, not pleasure. But monasteries also had better access to some luxuries. They might have spices for medicinal purposes. They'd have wine for Mass, and the monks got to drink some of it. They'd have honey from their own bees. Their bread was better quality. So even with restrictions, they ate reasonably well. Monks and nuns who were elderly or ill were given exemptions. They could stay in the infirmary, which was heated. They could eat better food, including meat. They could skip some services. The rule recognized that not everyone could maintain the same level of austerity. Now let's drift into how winter affected warfare, because wars didn't stop just because it was cold, though they definitely slowed down.
Medieval warfare was seasonal, generally. You fought in spring, summer, and early autumn when you could move armies, supply them, and actually accomplish something. Winter campaigns were rare because they were logistically nightmarish. But they did happen. Sometimes you'd maintain a siege through winter. If you had a castle surrounded and partially starved out, you might keep the siege going rather than let them recover. This meant your army was camping outside in winter, which was miserable for everyone. Soldiers would build temporary shelters, dig in, try to stay warm and fed while preventing the besieged from getting supplies. Sieges in winter often ended because the besiegers gave up and went home. It was just too hard to maintain an army in the field. Soldiers would desert, heading home to their farms. Supply lines would fail. Disease would ravage the camp. Eventually, the commander would call it off until spring.
The besieged had their own problems. If they'd been under siege since autumn, their food supplies would be dwindling. Winter meant no resupply, no relief force likely to arrive. They might hold out, hoping the besiegers would give up, or they might negotiate surrender before starvation forced them to. Some winter campaigns were strategic gambles. If you moved in winter, your enemy might not expect it. Surprise could win battles. But you were gambling that your army could survive the march, that supplies would hold out, that you'd achieve your objective before winter did you in. There are famous examples of winter campaigns going very wrong. Armies freezing while marching, supply wagons stuck in snow or mud, soldiers dying from exposure, entire campaigns collapsing not because of enemy action, but because of weather.
Soldiers in winter wore whatever warm clothes they had. There were no uniforms. You'd layer on wool, wrap yourself in your cloak, try to keep your fingers and feet functional. Armor was a problem. Metal gets very cold. Wearing full plate in winter was a good way to get frostbite. Soldiers would wear padded layers under armor for both protection and warmth. Weapons were affected by cold too. Bowstrings could freeze and snap. Sword hilts were painfully cold to grip. Crossbows were better in cold weather than longbows actually, because the mechanism was less affected by temperature. But everything was harder to use with frozen fingers. Horses suffered in winter campaigns. They needed more food to stay warm, but food was scarce. They'd slip on ice, struggle through snow, develop hoof problems from cold and wet. Losing your horse meant you were on foot, which in winter could be a death sentence. Garrisons holding castles through winter had a different experience. You were inside, sheltered, but isolated. If you were part of a castle garrison in winter, you'd do a lot of standing watch in freezing towers, walking cold walls, maintaining equipment, training to stay sharp. It was boring and cold, but safer than active campaigning. Most armies just went home for winter. Soldiers were often levies, peasants called up for military service. Come late autumn, they'd be released to go home for winter. They needed to be back on their farms, and lords needed them there too. Can't collect taxes from dead or landless peasants. Professional soldiers and household knights might stay with their lord through winter. This was when you'd train, maintain your gear, rest from the campaigning season. You'd drill, practice combat, keep yourself ready for spring. Castles would be reinforced and repaired during winter downtime. Walls that had been damaged in fighting, gates that needed replacing, stockpiles that needed replenishing. You'd prepare for the next campaigning season while winter kept everyone relatively peaceful. Border raids could happen in winter though. Quick strikes, grab some livestock or supplies, and get back across the border before a response could be organized. These weren't major military operations, more like large-scale banditry, but they kept border regions tense and dangerous year-round. Pirates and naval activity mostly stopped in winter. Storms made sailing too dangerous, harbors froze in the north. Ships would be pulled ashore for maintenance, and sailors would find other work or live off savings until spring. Coastal raiding, which was a major problem in some regions, paused for the season. Let's talk about the church calendar and how it structured winter life, because the rhythm of religious observance gave shape to the season. The church year started with Advent, which began 4 Sundays before Christmas. Advent was supposed to be a penitential season, a time of preparation and reflection. In practice, it was the lead-up to the biggest celebration of the year, so people were preparing feasts, not really fasting. Christmas was the highlight. December 25th and the following 12 days were celebration time. Even the poorest tried to have something special. Churches would be decorated with evergreen boughs and candles. Services would be elaborate with special music and ceremony.
The 12 days from Christmas to Epiphany on January 6th were a festival period. Different days had different traditions. St. Stephen's Day, Holy Innocents' Day, New Year's Day all had their own observances. This was when lords feasted their households, when communities came together, when the normal drudgery paused. Epiphany marked the end of Christmas season. This was when the wise men reached baby Jesus, so it was celebrated with gift-giving in some regions. After Epiphany, winter settled in for real. The parties were over. You had the rest of winter to get through with nothing to look forward to for a while. Candlemas on February 2nd was the next significant holy day. This celebrated the presentation of Jesus at the temple, and it was all about light and purification. People brought candles to church to be blessed. These blessed candles were used throughout the year for protection and comfort. Then came Lent, starting on Ash Wednesday. The date moved depending on when Easter fell, but it was usually late winter or early spring. Lent meant fasting, no meat, no celebrations. It was a serious, somber season. For 6 weeks, you'd restrict your diet even more than the winter restrictions already in place. But Lent also meant spring was coming. Easter was on the horizon. The worst of winter was past. Even though Lent was austere, there was hope now. The world was starting to wake up. Every Sunday was a feast day, technically, even in Lent. So you'd fast during the week, then eat a bit better on Sunday. This weekly rhythm gave you something regular to anticipate. Just get through to Sunday, then get through another week to the next Sunday. Saints' days peppered the calendar, giving more structure. Each saint had their day, and some were more important than others. Your local patron saint's day would be celebrated. Saints associated with winter concerns, Saint Blaise for throats, Saint Anthony for protection against fire, would get particular attention.
Churches held regular services throughout winter. Daily Mass in the morning, Vespers in the evening. These weren't just religious obligations. They were social events, community gathering points, warmth and light and structure in the cold darkness. Confession and penance were part of religious life. You'd confess your sins to a priest regularly. He'd assign penance, prayers to say, good works to do, fasts to observe. This was supposed to keep you spiritually healthy, though it also gave the church significant social control. Religious plays and performances happened in winter, especially around Christmas. Mystery plays telling Bible stories, nativity scenes, dramatizations of saints' lives. These were performed in churches or town squares. They were entertainment and education for a mostly illiterate population. Pilgrimages mostly didn't happen in winter because travel was too hard. But if you'd made a vow to go on pilgrimage, you might set out anyway. Some pilgrims would time their journey to reach their destination for a specific saint's feast day, even if it meant winter travel. This was considered especially pious and therefore spiritually valuable. Monasteries welcomed pilgrims year-round. They'd provide shelter, food, and access to whatever relics or holy sites they maintained. For monasteries, hosting pilgrims was a religious duty and also a source of income.
Pilgrims would make donations, buy badges or souvenirs, support the local economy. Death rituals continued through winter, as we mentioned earlier. The church provided structure for grief. Funeral masses, prayers for the dead, memorial services. The promise of resurrection and eternal life was comforting when death was so present.
The church taught that suffering was spiritually valuable. Winter suffering could be offered up as penance, as prayer, as a way to grow closer to God. This gave meaning to the misery. You weren't just cold and hungry, you were participating in Christ's suffering, purifying your soul, earning spiritual merit. This might sound like manipulation, and in some ways it was, but it also genuinely helped people cope. Having a framework that made suffering meaningful rather than random made it more bearable. Faith provided hope and community and purpose. Let's talk about specific winter foods and how people actually ate them, because the daily reality of medieval winter diet was both monotonous and occasionally creative. Pottage was the staple. We keep mentioning it because you ate it constantly, but what actually was pottage? It was basically a thick stew made from whatever you had. You'd start with water or broth, add dried peas or beans for protein and bulk, throw in chopped root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips, onions if you had them. You'd add herbs for flavor, parsley, sage, whatever you dried from your garden. If you had any meat or meat scraps, in they went. This all cooked together for hours, becoming a thick, porridgey stew. You'd eat it with bread, using the bread to scoop it up. Or you'd make trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that served as edible bowls. You'd pile pottage on the trencher, eat the whole thing, nothing wasted. The pottage pot basically never got fully emptied. You'd eat some, leave some, add more ingredients, cook it again. The pot was a continuous cycle. This sounds disgusting by modern food safety standards, and it kind of was, but the constant boiling killed most bacteria, and people's immune systems were adapted to it. Different regions had variations. In England, peas pottage made from yellow split peas was common. In France, you might have garbure, which was similar but used different vegetables and sometimes bits of preserved goose. In Eastern Europe, beet-based stews were popular. But the concept was the same everywhere. Boiled vegetables and legumes, eaten hot, filling your belly. Bread was crucial. The type of bread you ate indicated your social status. White bread made from wheat flour was for the wealthy. Brown bread made from barley or rye was for everyone else. Maslin bread made from mixed grains was common. The bread was dense and heavy, made to last. Bread baking happened in big batches because heating an oven was a production. You'd make enough bread to last a week. The bread would get progressively staler, but you'd use it anyway. Stale bread soaked in pottage or ale softened up fine. In some areas, you'd make flatbreads or oatcakes instead of leavened bread. These were simpler, didn't require an oven, could be cooked on a griddle over your fire. They weren't as good as proper bread, but they were easier to make. Porridge made from oats was a northern staple, especially in Scotland and northern England. You'd cook oats in water or milk if you had it, add a bit of salt, and eat it hot. It was bland but nutritious and warming. You could make it thick or thin, depending on how much water you used. Thick porridge was more filling. Preserved meats were a treat, but also kind of terrible. Salted pork or beef was so salty you'd have to soak it in water before cooking.
changing the water several times to leach out some of the salt. Then you'd boil it, probably add it to pottage or eat it with bread. It was tough and salty and not particularly pleasant, but it was protein.
Bacon was popular because pork salted and smoked well. A little bacon could flavor a whole pot of pottage. You weren't eating bacon slabs like modern breakfast bacon. You were using small amounts to add fat and flavor to other dishes. Sausages were a way to use every part of a slaughtered animal. You'd stuff intestines with meat scraps, fat, blood, grain, spices if you had them. Blood sausage was common. Mix blood with fat and oatmeal or barley, stuff it, cook it. It sounds gross, but it was nutritious and nothing went to waste. Fish, as we mentioned, was heavily salted or dried. Salted herring was a major food source in coastal areas and anywhere trade could reach. It was cheap protein. You'd soak it to remove some salt, then cook it. Dried stockfish was so hard you'd beat it with a hammer to break it down, then soak it for days before you could cook it. But it lasted indefinitely, which made it valuable. Cheese was important. Hard cheese aged for months could last through winter. You'd grate it into pottage, eat it with bread, or just eat chunks of it. It provided fat and protein. The cheese you had in winter was sharp and hard and strong flavored, but it was good food. Butter was preserved in salt, becoming salted butter that lasted longer but tasted very salty. You'd use it for cooking more than spreading, or you'd clarify it, melting it and removing the solids, creating something closer to modern ghee that kept better. Eggs were fewer in winter because chickens laid less, but you might still get some eggs. Fresh eggs were precious. You might preserve eggs in various ways, storing them in ash or sawdust, coating them in fat, or pickling them. Or you'd just eat them when you got them and go without the rest of the time. Vegetables were limited to what kept. Turnips were reliable. They stored well and were filling if boring. Onions and garlic added flavor to everything. Carrots and parsnips were good. Cabbage could be preserved as sauerkraut or stored as whole heads in a root cellar. Dried mushrooms were used for flavoring. You'd pick mushrooms in autumn, dry them, then rehydrate them in winter for cooking. This added an earthy, savory flavor to stews. Herbs and spices were mostly for the wealthy. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, these came from far away and were expensive. The rich would use them to show off and to make preserved foods more palatable. The poor made do with local herbs, parsley, sage, thyme, whatever they'd dried from their summer gardens. Honey was the sweetener. Sugar existed but was rare and expensive. Honey kept indefinitely. You'd use it in cooking, in drinks, as medicine. Monasteries and estates with beehives had honey. If you didn't, you went without sweetness. Drinks were ale for most people, wine for the wealthy. Ale was made from grain, water, and herbs for bittering before hops became standard. It was nutritious and safe. You'd drink it weak in the morning, stronger in the evening. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Everyone drank it. Wine was a southern thing mostly, though it was traded north. In wine-producing regions, everyone drank wine. In the north, wine was a luxury. Spiced wine, mulled wine, hippocras, these were winter drinks for the wealthy. Heat wine, add spices, drink it hot. It warmed you from inside. Mead, made from fermented honey, was traditional, but less common than ale. Cider from apples was regional. In Normandy and parts of England, cider was the drink of choice. Water was drunk when you had to, but it was risky. Well water might be okay, river water probably wasn't. You'd boil it if you were smart, but that required fuel. Easier to just drink weak ale. The wealthy had access to more variety. Imported fruits like raisins and figs, nuts like almonds and walnuts, spices to make things taste better, multiple courses at meals, fresh killed meat occasionally. But even they were eating a lot of preserved and stored foods in winter. Now, as we drift toward the end of this part, let's touch on some strange and specific winter survival tales, the odd little historical moments that show just how weird and difficult winter could be. There's a record from a monastery in Germany in the 1300s, where the ink froze in the scriptorium. The monk copying a manuscript noted in the margin that his hands were so cold he couldn't hold the quill properly, and the ink kept freezing solid. He had to keep warming it by the candle flame, which risked fire damage to the manuscript. But he kept working because the work had to be done. In harsh winters, people would sometimes bring their most valuable animals inside to sleep with them. Not just cows in the other end of the longhouse, but like chickens in your actual sleeping space. Goats in the bedroom. Because if these animals died, you'd starve next year. So you dealt with sleeping next to a goat. Your life depended on that goat.
There are accounts of people getting lost in snowstorms, just traveling between their house and their barn. Visibility would drop to nothing. You'd lose your way in your own yard. Farmers would string ropes between buildings so they could follow them in storms. Without that rope, you could wander in circles in a blizzard until you froze to death 20 feet from your own door. In the terrible winter of 1564, there are reports from London of the Thames freezing so thoroughly that people held frost fairs on it. They set up shops and games and even roasted a whole ox on the ice. This sounds delightful in a story, but think about what it meant. The main waterway through London, the city's commercial lifeline, was completely frozen. Trade stopped. The poor froze in their homes, while the rich held parties on the ice. There's a case from medieval Scotland where an entire village was snowed in for weeks. When the snow finally melted and outsiders reached them, half the village was dead. They'd run out of food and fuel. The survivors had burned furniture, parts of their houses, anything combustible. They'd eaten everything, including things you shouldn't eat. The rescue party found scenes they described as hellish. In Iceland, there are sagas mentioning winters where farmsteads would be completely buried in snow. The family would dig tunnels to move between buildings. Sometimes they'd dig up to let smoke out and light in. They'd live underground, essentially, waiting for spring. And sometimes spring would come, and when neighbors finally reached them, everyone was dead. The farm would be abandoned, considered haunted. There are records of ships being frozen into harbors and their crews having to winter aboard, trapped in the ice. Supplies would run low. Scurvy would set in from lack of fresh food. By spring, the crew might be dead or too weak to sail. The ship would be salvaged by whoever found it first. During the Great Famine period, there are documented cases of people eating things that normally wouldn't be considered food. Bark from trees, boiled until soft, grass and leaves, clay, which fills your stomach even if it doesn't nourish you.
These weren't sustainable, and people died anyway, but desperation drives you to try anything.
There's a story from France of a noble family that got stranded in their hunting lodge by a surprise blizzard. They'd gone out for a day of hunting and ended up trapped for weeks. They had to slaughter their horses for food, burn furniture and even parts of the building for heat. When they finally made it back to their castle, they were traumatized. The Lord apparently never hunted in winter again. Some winter tales are almost darkly funny. There's an account of a monastery where the monks were so cold during services that they could barely chant. The abbot finally allowed them to wear extra layers under their habits, but this made them look ridiculously bulky. Visitors described them as looking like overstuffed sausages waddling through their prayers. There's a legal case from England where a man sued his neighbor for stealing his dung heap. In winter, dung heaps would steam because of the decomposition process, creating a bit of warmth. The neighbor apparently had been sneaking over to sleep next to someone else's pile of manure. I don't know how it resolved, but imagine being so cold you'd risk legal trouble to sleep next to someone else's pile of manure. Childbirth in winter produced some grim stories. There's a record of a woman giving birth during a blizzard with no midwife able to reach her. Her husband had to deliver the baby himself with no knowledge of what to do. Miraculously, both survived. The child was nicknamed Snowborn and apparently grew up healthy. Less fortunate are the many records of women dying in childbirth in winter, unable to get help, or babies dying of cold within hours of birth, despite everything their mothers tried. These weren't rare tragedies, they were common enough that they're recorded in parish records all across Europe. Winter drownings were a specific hazard. People would try to cross frozen rivers or ponds. The ice would break. In heavy winter clothing, you'd sink immediately. Even if you could swim in summer, winter clothes waterlogged would drag you down. And even if you managed to get out, you'd freeze from the wet cold before you could get help.
There are accounts of children playing on ice who fell through and couldn't be saved. Their bodies would be recovered when the ice melted in spring. Communities would find them downstream, perfectly preserved by the cold, looking like they were just sleeping. Fires in winter were both salvation and threat. A house fire in winter meant you lost your shelter in the worst possible season. You'd be homeless in freezing weather. Communities would try to help, cramming families into already crowded homes. But not everyone could be accommodated. Some people just died from exposure after their homes burned. And with that cheerful thought, we'll pause here. You're hopefully drifting off, warm and comfortable, appreciating your heated home and varied diet, and general lack of mortal peril from the weather. Medieval winter was survival mode for months at a time, and we've still got more to explore about this frozen world. But for now, rest easy. Spring always came. Eventually.
Welcome to the last stretch of our medieval winter journey. By now, you should be deeply relaxed, maybe half asleep already, which is exactly where you should be. Let's ease through these final topics and bring this whole frozen story to a gentle close. We've talked a bit about the physical challenges of medieval winter, but let's spend some time on what it did to people's minds. Because living through months of cold, dark, hunger, and isolation wasn't just hard on the body, it was psychologically brutal. Seasonal depression was absolutely a thing, even if medieval people didn't have a name for it. They noticed that people got sadder in winter.
Melancholy was recognized as a condition. The theory was that it came from an imbalance of black bile, one of the four humors, which was associated with cold and dryness. So winter, being cold, would naturally increase melancholy. The treatment for melancholy was not great. Physicians might recommend bloodletting, which obviously didn't help. They might prescribe herbs like St. John's wort, which actually does have some antidepressant properties, so that was accidentally useful. They'd recommend music, pleasant company, good food, and light, which are all genuinely helpful for depression, so they got some things right, even if the reasoning was wrong. But most people didn't have access to physicians. If you were depressed, you just suffered through it. You might pray more, which could provide comfort. You might talk to your priest, who'd offer spiritual counsel and remind you that suffering brings you closer to God. Helpful or not, it was what was available. The darkness was particularly hard on people. Humans need light. We're diurnal creatures. Living in near constant darkness for months messes with your circadian rhythms, your mood, your entire sense of well-being. Medieval people noticed this. They understood that winter darkness made people feel terrible. They just couldn't do much about it.
Candles and oil lamps helped, but they weren't bright enough to really substitute for daylight. You'd have dim, flickering light for a few hours in the evening, and that was it. The rest was darkness. Your whole world shrank to the small circle of light around your fire or candle. This isolation and darkness led to what we'd now call cabin fever. Being stuck inside with the same people for months caused tension. Families argued more in winter. Domestic disputes increased. Everyone was irritable and stressed and taking it on each other. There are medieval court records showing spikes in assault cases in late winter. People would snap after months of confinement. A minor argument would escalate into violence. Usually it was just shoving or a thrown object, but sometimes it got serious. The courts generally understood that winter made people crazy and would be a bit more lenient with winter disputes. Marriage strain was real. Imagine being stuck in one room with your spouse and children for 4 or 5 months. No privacy, no escape, no break. Even if you loved each other, you'd get on each other's nerves. Medieval records show a spike in separations and annulments requested in spring. Couples would make it through winter and then immediately seek to end the marriage. For people who were already struggling mentally, winter could push them over the edge. Depression could become suicidal. There are records of suicides in winter, though they're underreported, because the church considered suicide a mortal sin. Families would hide suicides if they could, claiming the deceased was an accident to ensure the deceased could be buried in consecrated ground. Alcohol abuse was common in winter. Drinking was normalized anyway in medieval culture, but it increased in winter. Ale dulled the misery, warmed you from inside, made time pass easier. Problem drinking wasn't recognized as a medical issue. It was just something that happened. If someone drank too much, they were weak-willed or sinful, not sick.
Domestic situations could turn dark in winter isolation. Abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, happened year-round, but winter's confinement made it worse. Victims had nowhere to go, no escape. Community oversight was reduced because everyone was isolated. Whatever happened inside your house stayed there. This is an ugly reality of medieval life, and winter made it worse. There were some protections. The church spoke against spousal abuse. Neighbors would sometimes intervene. Extreme cases could be brought to manor courts. But mostly, what happened in private stayed private, and winter increased privacy while decreasing options for escape or help. Children suffered particularly from winter's psychological effects. They had energy and curiosity and no outlet for it. Being cooped up inside made them restless and difficult. Parents had limited patience when they were cold and hungry and stressed themselves. Discipline was harsh. Children were expected to be quiet, obedient, and useful. Childhood mortality in winter was high enough that parents were somewhat emotionally guarded. You didn't know if your child would survive to adulthood. About a third of children died before age 5. Winter increased those odds, so parents couldn't invest fully emotionally because the loss would be devastating. This created a certain emotional distance that seems cold to us, but was protective for them. Still, parents loved their children. Records show genuine grief when children died. Mothers would mourn lost babies. Fathers would endow masses for deceased children's souls. The love was there, just tempered by the reality that death was common. Adolescents had their own struggles. Teenagers stuck inside with nothing to do and hormones raging was a recipe for trouble. Romances would start just from proximity and boredom. Pregnancies would result, leading to hasty marriages or scandal. Young men would get into fights out of sheer restlessness. Young women would clash with parents over restrictions and expectations.
The elderly faced winter with resignation often. If you'd lived through many winters, you knew what to expect. But you also knew that each winter might be your last. Older people would often put their affairs in order in autumn, making wills, confessing sins, saying what might be final goodbyes. Some wouldn't bother stockpiling as much food, figuring they might not need it. There's a grim practicality to this. If Grandpa dies in December, that's more food for the rest of the family to survive on. Nobody said this out loud, but everyone understood the math. One less mouth to feed increased everyone else's odds. Some elderly people would voluntarily reduce their food intake, eating less to leave more for younger family members. This self-sacrifice was respected and expected. You'd lived your life. The children needed to survive to continue the family. So you'd eat less, grow weaker, and quietly fade. This sounds horrifying, and it is, but it was also considered honorable. You were doing your duty to your family, and in a world where resources were finite and survival uncertain, these calculations had to be made. Let's shift to something slightly less grim and talk more about superstitions, because medieval winter was thick with them. We mentioned the wild hunt earlier, but there were so many other winter supernatural beliefs. Ghosts and spirits were thought to be more active in winter darkness. The boundary between the living world and the spirit world was thin. You needed to be careful.
Crossroads were dangerous at night, especially in winter. Crossroads were liminal spaces where spirits could cross over. You'd avoid them after dark, if possible. If you had to pass one, you'd say a prayer or make a protective gesture. Certain nights were particularly dangerous. New Year's Eve, 12th night, and other significant dates were when spirits were most active. You'd perform protective rituals, hanging iron over doors because spirits couldn't cross iron, scattering salt for purification, keeping holy water on hand.
People believed that what you did on certain days would affect the whole year. There were elaborate systems of divination. If it rained on St. Swithin's Day, it would rain for 40 days. If you saw a new moon through glass, it was bad luck. If you heard certain birds calling, it meant death was coming. Dreams in winter were considered particularly significant. The darkness and cold supposedly made the veil between worlds thinner, making prophetic dreams more likely. People would try to interpret their dreams, looking for messages from God, warnings from spirits, or glimpses of the future. Love divination was popular among young people in winter. Girls would perform rituals to see visions of their future husbands. Apple peels thrown over your shoulder would land in the shape of his initial. Looking in a mirror at midnight on certain nights would show his face. Sleeping with certain herbs under your pillow would make you dream of him. None of this worked, obviously, but it gave young people something to do and something to hope for. Winter was boring. Magical thinking made it more interesting.
Weather prediction was a constant preoccupation. People watched animal behavior, cloud formations, wind directions, anything that might tell them what was coming. Some of this was based on genuine observation and pattern recognition. Some was pure superstition, but all of it was an attempt to feel some control over an uncontrollable situation. Wolves were supernatural as well as physical threats. They were associated with demons and evil spirits. A wolf howling near your home was a death omen. Werewolf beliefs were common. The idea that people could transform into wolves, especially in winter. This probably arose from a combination of wolf attacks, mental illness causing people to act strangely, and general winter paranoia. The devil was thought to be more active in winter. Cold and darkness were his domain. He'd tempt people into despair, sin, giving up hope. Priests would warn against winter depression because it made you vulnerable to demonic influence. If you felt hopeless, that was the devil working on you. You needed to resist through prayer and faith. Illness was often attributed to spiritual causes. If you got sick in winter, you might have been cursed, or sinned and were being punished, or were being tested by God. The actual biological causes weren't understood, so people looked for spiritual explanations and spiritual cures. Protective charms were common. You'd wear a cross, obviously, but also other items, a rabbit's foot for luck, an amulet with holy words written on it, a small bag of herbs for protection. The church officially disapproved of non-Christian magic, but in practice, people blended Christian and folk beliefs freely. Blessing everything was routine. Your house, your animals, your food, your tools. Priests would bless them, or you'd say prayers over them yourself. This gave you a sense of having done something to improve your odds, even if it actually didn't change anything. Now, let's talk specifically about children's winter experiences in more detail, because their perspective was unique. If you were a peasant child in medieval winter, your world was very small. You probably rarely left your village anyway, but in winter, you might not even leave your house for days at a time. Your entire existence was one room, your family, the fire. Play was limited. You didn't have manufactured toys. You might have a rag doll, a ball made of wrapped cloth, a stick, some stones. You'd make up games with whatever was available. Storytelling games, pretend play, simple physical games that could be done in a small space. Children would be given small tasks to keep them useful.
Even young children could help, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, stirring the pot, watching a younger sibling. You learned by doing. By age 7 or so, you were expected to do real work, not just play. Education for peasant children was minimal. You'd learn your prayers by rote. Maybe you'd learn some Bible stories from church, but reading and writing were rare skills you probably wouldn't learn. You didn't need them for farm work. Your education was practical: how to care for animals, how to plant and harvest, how to preserve food, how to survive. Noble children had a different experience. You'd have tutors, lessons, books if your family could afford them, but you'd still be cold. The schoolroom might have a fire, but it wasn't enough to truly warm the space. You'd sit wrapped in your cloak, trying to focus on Latin grammar while your fingers were too cold to hold the pen properly.
Physical training for noble boys continued in winter when possible. You'd practice swordplay, riding, hunting skills. This was your future profession, so the training was serious. But practicing combat in freezing weather was miserable. Your muscles didn't work as well in the cold. The equipment was painfully cold to handle. Noble girls learned their expected skills: household management, needlework, music, dancing, reading, religious knowledge. You were being prepared to manage a noble household and make a good marriage. Winter was actually good for this education because you were inside anyway, might as well do embroidery. Children of all classes were told stories constantly. Storytelling was the primary entertainment. Parents, grandparents, older siblings would tell tales. Bible stories, saints' lives, local legends, fairy tales. These stories passed on cultural values, kept oral history alive, and entertained everyone during long, dark evenings. Some stories were specifically winter tales, stories about the dangers of winter, about people who survived through cleverness or faith, about magical winter creatures. These entertained, but also taught lessons about winter survival. Games that could be played inside were valued. Dice games, board games like Nine Men's Morris or chess if you had them, word games, riddles. These kept minds active and time passing. When weather allowed, children would play outside in snow and ice, sledding on any slope you could find, using wooden boards or animal skins, ice skating on frozen ponds, using animal bones as skates, snowball fights, building snow figures, sliding on ice. These activities were fun, but also risky. Injuries from falls were common. Frostbite was a real possibility. Children would come inside with numb fingers and toes, crying from the pain as they thawed. Parents would scold them for being careless, then let them do the same thing the next day because children need to play. Illness in children was frightening for everyone. A child's cold could become pneumonia quickly. A minor fever could turn deadly. Parents would try every remedy they knew. Herbal teas, poultices, prayers, calling a physician if they could afford it. Often all you could do was wait and hope. When a child died in winter, the grief was compounded by the practical problems. The ground was frozen, burial was difficult. The family was stuck in their small space with their grief, unable to escape it. Other children would be aware of death happening right there, processing it in whatever way they could. But children are resilient. They adapted to winter as normal. If you grew up with it, it was just life. You didn't know any different. Yes, winter was hard, but spring always came. You learned that pattern. Endure winter, enjoy summer. Prepare for the next winter. Let's drift over to a completely different part of the medieval world and talk about winter in the Islamic world and Byzantine Empire, because their experiences were different in interesting ways. The medieval Islamic world stretched from Spain to Persia, covering a huge range of climates. In the southern parts, North Africa, Arabia, parts of the Middle East, winter was mild or even pleasant. These regions didn't face the survival challenges of northern Europe. But in the northern parts of the Islamic world, winter was real. Anatolia, Persia, the mountains of Afghanistan and Central Asia, these places got cold. Snow, freezing temperatures, the whole experience. Islamic cities had some advantages. Urban planning in Islamic civilization was often more advanced than in medieval Europe. Cities had better water systems, better sanitation, public bathhouses. These continued functioning in winter in warmer regions, providing hygiene and social space. Bathhouses were important in Islamic culture for both cleanliness and socializing. In winter, a warm bathhouse was a refuge. You could get properly warm, bathe, socialize, then head back into the cold feeling human again. This was a significant quality of life advantage over Northern Europe, where bathing in winter was nearly impossible. Architecture in Islamic regions was often designed for heat management, which made it less ideal for cold. Courtyards, fountains, open spaces, these were great for staying cool in summer, but let in cold in winter. So wealthy homes would have winter quarters, rooms that could be sealed off and heated more effectively. Heating was done with braziers often, metal containers filled with hot coals. These could be moved around, placed under low tables with blankets over them, so you'd sit with your legs under the warm blanket. This was more flexible than fixed fireplaces. Food preservation in Islamic regions used some of the same techniques as Europe: salting, drying, smoking, but warmer climates also allowed for different methods. Olive oil preservation was common. Sun-drying fruits was easier with more reliable sun. Spice access was better, making preserved foods taste better. The Islamic world had better access to citrus fruits, which helped prevent scurvy. Oranges, lemons, limes, these were available in winter in southern regions and traded north. This was a genuine health advantage. Trade continued year-round in much of the Islamic world because shipping on the Mediterranean was possible even in winter, and overland caravan routes through deserts were actually easier in winter than summer. This meant cities stayed supplied even in the cold months. The Islamic calendar is lunar, so holidays don't align with seasons consistently. But winter still had its rhythm. Scholarship and study were valued in Islamic culture, and winter was good for this. Madrasas, the educational institutions, would be busy with students studying theology, law, mathematics, science. In colder regions of the Islamic world, winter survival looked more like European experiences. Rural farmers in Anatolia or Persia faced similar challenges: stockpiling food, keeping animals alive, enduring cold and dark. But the cultural context was different, the architecture different, the food different. The Byzantine Empire, centered on Constantinople, had its own winter experience. The city itself rarely got extremely cold because of its coastal location, but it definitely had winter. The empire extended into colder regions, though, the Balkans, parts of Anatolia, where winter was harsh.
Constantinople had advantages as a major city. It had Roman infrastructure still functioning. Aqueducts brought water, public buildings, baths, markets all operated. The city was wealthy and well supplied through trade.
Byzantine architecture used Roman techniques. Heated floors in wealthy homes, thick walls, good construction. The rich had comfortable homes, relatively speaking. The poor still suffered, crowded into inadequate housing, but the city had better resources than most medieval places. The Byzantine court was elaborate and formal, and this continued through winter. Ceremonies, religious observances, political functions all went on. The emperor and his court wore their elaborate robes and maintained their dignified rituals even when it was freezing. Byzantine Christianity had a different calendar than Western Christianity, but winter still meant religious observances. The Nativity fast before Christmas, Christmas itself, Epiphany. Churches would be crowded and ornate services performed. The Hagia Sophia, that magnificent building, would be cold but beautiful, filled with candlelight and chanting. Food in Constantinople was more varied than in most of Europe. The city imported goods from all over, grain from Egypt and the Black Sea region, fish from local waters, vegetables and fruits from nearby regions. Even in winter, markets had options. But outside the capital, in rural Byzantine territories, winter was as hard as anywhere. Farmers in Macedonia or Thrace faced cold, snow, and the same struggle to survive. The empire's themes, military districts, had soldiers who needed to be supplied through winter. This was a logistical challenge the empire managed with varying success. The Byzantine Empire's gradual decline meant resources became more limited over time. By the late medieval period, winters were harder because the empire was poorer, less able to maintain infrastructure, less able to supply its population. This contributed to the eventual fall to the Ottomans. Now let's talk about the technological and social changes that slowly made winter more survivable over the medieval period and beyond. Medieval people weren't static. They innovated, they adapted, they improved things gradually. Winter survival got better over time, though it was still hard. Architecture improved. Early medieval buildings were crude. By the late medieval period, construction techniques were better. Chimneys became more common, which was a huge improvement over central hearths with smoke holes. A proper chimney drew smoke out efficiently and allowed for larger, better controlled fires. Glass windows became more common in later medieval period, at least for the wealthy and for churches. Glass let in light while keeping out cold and wind. This was a significant comfort improvement. Early glass was poor quality, full of bubbles and ripples, but it worked. Clothing technology improved. Tailoring got better. Buttons were invented and became common in the 13th and 14th centuries. This allowed for better fitted clothes that conserved warmth more effectively than just wrapped fabric. Layering became more sophisticated. Knitting was invented or introduced to Europe in the medieval period. Knitted items, stockings, gloves, caps, were warmer and fit better than woven items. This genuinely improved people's ability to keep extremities warm. Food preservation got better. People refined their techniques. Salting became more effective with better understanding of ratios and methods. Smoking techniques improved. Storage methods got better. Agriculture slowly improved. better plows, crop rotation, fertilization techniques. These led to better harvests, which meant more food stored for winter. The surplus wasn't huge, but every bit helped. Trade networks expanded. Even small villages might have access to some traded goods by the late medieval period. Salted fish from the coast, grain from more productive regions, tools and goods from towns. This made communities less isolated and less vulnerable to local failures. Mills, water mills, and windmills became more common. These made grain processing easier and more efficient. You could mill more flour with less labor, which was especially valuable in winter when labor was limited. The Little Ice Age, starting around 1300, actually spurred some innovations. Faced with colder winters and worse harvests, people had to adapt. Cold-resistant crops were developed or emphasized. Storage techniques improved out of necessity. Communities became better organized for mutual aid. Guilds and civic organizations developed systems for winter charity. Grain stores maintained by city governments could be distributed in hard times. Guilds took care of their members. Churches organized relief. These safety nets were imperfect, but they helped.
Legal and social changes mattered too. Peasants slowly gained some rights and protections. The complete serfdom of early medieval period loosened in many areas by late medieval period. Having some control over your own labor and production made winter planning more effective. The Black Death, horrific as it was, changed labor dynamics. With so much population dead, surviving laborers had more bargaining power. Wages rose, conditions improved. This meant peasants could afford more food, better tools, better housing. Winter became slightly less lethal for those who survived the plague. Printing, invented in the 15th century, started spreading knowledge more widely. Agricultural manuals, medical texts, practical guides, these became available to more people. Education slowly expanded. Better information led to better practices. But we should be clear, these improvements were gradual and uneven. A peasant in 1400 still had a miserable winter, just maybe slightly less miserable than in 900. Real dramatic improvement in winter survival didn't come until the modern period. The scientific revolution, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, these finally changed the equation. Understanding of disease, nutrition, thermodynamics, development of efficient heating, insulation, food preservation, and transportation. These are what truly made winter manageable. But even the small medieval improvements mattered to the people experiencing them. A chimney instead of a smoke hole was life-changing. Glass windows were incredible luxury. Extra food stored was survival.
Medieval people weren't passively suffering. They were actively trying to make things better. Most innovations failed or had minimal impact, but some worked, and over generations things slowly got less terrible. Let's think about what we can learn from all this medieval winter misery. First, human resilience is incredible. Medieval people endured conditions we can barely imagine. They did it year after year, generation after generation. They didn't just survive, they built civilizations, created art, raised families, found joy and meaning in life despite the hardship. Second, community matters. Nobody survived medieval winter alone. You needed your family, your neighbors, your village. The societies that survived were the ones that developed systems for mutual support and cooperation. Third, incremental improvement matters. Medieval people couldn't fix winter. They couldn't make it warm or bring fresh food into existence, but they could make small things better. A slightly better house, a slightly better preservation technique. Each small improvement helped. Fourth, adaptation is constant. Humans are incredibly adaptable. We can survive in almost any environment, tolerate almost any condition. Medieval people adapted to winter as their normal reality. They found ways to cope, to continue, to even find pleasure in the midst of hardship.
Fifth, context matters for understanding history. We can't really understand medieval people without understanding their material conditions. Religion, politics, culture, all of these were shaped by the basic struggle to survive. Winter shaped medieval life profoundly. Sixth, privilege has always existed. Medieval winter was harder for the poor than the rich, harder for the vulnerable than the powerful. The social structures that protected some people and left others to suffer weren't natural or inevitable. They were human-made and could have been different. And finally, seventh, we should appreciate what we have. Our lives are unimaginably comfortable compared to medieval existence. Central heating, electric lights, grocery stores, modern medicine, emergency services. We live in luxury that medieval kings couldn't have imagined. When you're annoyed about scraping ice off your car or paying your heating bill, remember what actual winter hardship looked like. Remember people huddling around inadequate fires, eating moldy bread, watching their children die from cold and hunger, enduring months of darkness and despair. This isn't to say our problems aren't real. They are. But we have resources and options that medieval people would have considered miraculous. A bit of perspective helps. As we come to the end of this very, very long journey through medieval winter, let's bring it back to where we started. Winter in medieval times was survival. It was months of cold, hunger, darkness, illness, death, and endurance. Spring wasn't guaranteed. You might not make it. Many people didn't. Every winter took its toll. But for those who survived, spring was rebirth. The sun returned, warmth returned, life returned. The first crocus pushing through snow, the first bird returning from migration, the first warm day where you could go outside without pain. These were miracles. They were proof that the darkness wasn't permanent, that life continued, that you'd made it through once again. Medieval peoples celebrated spring with genuine joy. Easter was resurrection in every sense. The world had died and was reborn. You had died a little and were reborn. Another year, another chance, another cycle beginning. And then autumn would come, and you'd prepare for winter again, because winter always came back. You couldn't prevent it. You could only prepare, endure, and hope. This cycle defined medieval life. Plant in spring, grow in summer, harvest in autumn, survive in winter. Repeat. Your whole life was this pattern. Your parents' lives, your grandparents' lives, back through generations. This was the human condition. Until, slowly, gradually, it wasn't. Until technology and knowledge accumulated enough that winter stopped being quite so deadly.
until humans could finally control their environment rather than just endure it.
We're still in that process. Climate change is showing us that we don't control nature as much as we thought. But we have capabilities medieval people couldn't dream of. We can keep ourselves warm, fed, healthy through winter. We've broken the cycle of seasonal survival, at least in the developed world. This is extraordinary. This is worth acknowledging. We live in the safest, most comfortable period in human history. Our ancestors struggled through endless winters so that we could have this. We're the beneficiaries of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and incremental improvement. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, warm and safe and comfortable, appreciate it. Feel grateful for your heating system, your insulated walls, your refrigerator full of food, your electric lights pushing back the darkness. And maybe spare a thought for all those medieval peasants and nobles and monks and merchants who endured winter after winter, who kept going despite everything, who survived long enough to have children, who survived to have children, eventually leading to you. You're here because your ancestors were tough enough to make it through medieval winter, hundreds of times, thousands of times, generation after generation of survival. That's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Sleep well, warm and safe in your modern comfort. Dream of spring if you like, or don't dream at all. Just rest peacefully, deeply grateful that you're not a medieval peasant waking up in the dark to restart a fire in a freezing hovel while facing another day of survival. Medieval winter was brutal. Our winter is mild inconvenience, and that's perhaps the most comforting thought of all. Sweet dreams, everyone. Thanks for sticking with this very long, very sleepy journey through the frozen medieval world. Rest easy, knowing that winter, both literal and metaphorical, always eventually gives way to spring. Until next time, sleep well.